didn't want him to think I'd never done it before, and that I wasn't the girl every guy at school thought I was. You were known as a player? Hiccup asked, raising an eyebrow in intrigue and slight disgust. But Astrid just chuckled and shook her head. No, a girl isn't called a player if she sleeps around with loads of guys. No, I was the school slut. But it made me popular, so I didn't care. Even though now, looking back on it, it was a mistake. Why is that? Because maybe if I had been more true to myself and just told everyone that I was still a virgin, I might have lost it to someone better. Like you. She muttered the last two words to herself as her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Luckily Hiccup hadn't heard her. So what happened? Right. So we got into the stall and we started doing our thing and making out and all of that. All the while, people were coming in and out of the bathrooms, and some were actually having sex in the bathroom stall next to us while we were just getting started. It was really awkward. And you want to know the worst part? What's the worst part? He had the smallest penis I had ever seen on a guy before. Seriously. It was tiny. I mean, it wasn't even big enough to break through my hymen, but it was so small that my first time didn't even hurt that much. I mean, it did still hurt, but not as much as I had been told by my friends. Really? So he must have barely touched the surface? Hiccup asked, slightly intrigued despite how embarrassing the conversation must have been for Astrid. But was fine with it, now seeing the humor in it almost 7 years later. I mean, if we're doing any comparisons. Astrid paused, unsure whether she should finish that sentence. Don't let it boost your ego, but you're probably the only person that I've managed to orgasm with. Astrid blushed hard, her cheeks burning and her head hanging low, all the while keeping her eyes on the road. Hiccup smiled and blushed at the compliment, feeling a rush of joy and self-confidence flood through his system at her words. He turned away from her at the same time as she turned away from him and blushed himself. Really? Thank you. He replied sheepishly, not sure what to do with himself now. Freya knows what it would have been like if we had done it sober. You think it would have been better? Hiccup asked curiously, raising an eyebrow slightly. I don't know, but I know you would have remembered it better. Chapter 40, Chapter 38. Chapter text. A few weeks had passed since their incident at the cove, and neither of them had brought it up since. Instead, they made little jokes about the whole thing, laughing and teasing each other like friends do. To them, it had turned into a little joke, and they had gone, mostly, back to normal. Hey, have you seen my tie? Hiccup asked as he came downstairs in a hurry, his shirt collar up and top button undone as he rushed down the stairs. Astrid was in the kitchen finishing up the last of her coffee and smiled at his slightly bedraggled look. No, but have you seen yourself? She asked with a chuckle. Hold on, she replied before rushing into the laundry room. Hiccup frowned at her before looking at himself in the mirror and attempted to fix his hair. Found one of your ties. This'll do, right? Astrid emerged from the laundry room, flinging the door open, and handed Hiccup one of his ties with a kind smile. He took the tie out of her hand with a quick thank you and turned towards the mirror to help put it on. Hey, Hiccup turned to look over at Astrid who had called to him. She looked nervous as she fiddled with her fingers anxiously. Do you want me to help with that? She asked, barely able to look Hiccup in the eye as she pointed at his tie with a small blush appearing on her face. I mean, I understand if you don't want me to. It might be awkward, but I just thought I'd ask. You want to tie this for me? He asked, raising an eyebrow at the odd request. But he smiled and nodded, taking a step closer to her while still holding the two ends of the tie. Sure, if you could, that would be great. To tell you the truth, he leaned in close. I don't really know how to tie it myself. He smiled before standing up straight and letting go of the tie for Astrid to grab. Astrid held the tie in between her fingers, delicately wrapping it around itself and tying it up for Hiccup. She could feel his gaze on her the entire time, a soft, warm appreciation mixed in with something else that she could never quite figure out. But as she finished and looked up to meet his eye, she swore she saw a flicker of it before he turned away. Was it love? There you go, now you're looking smart. Ah. Thank you, Astrid. You're the best. He said and smiled brightly. The next moment happened completely unconsciously and without thought, as Hiccup reached down to Astrid's height and placed a small, gentle peck onto her cheek. There was nothing meaningful behind it, nothing to talk about. But it stirred up something within Astrid that made her freeze as she looked up to Hiccup. However, he just smiled, unaware of the consequences to his actions, and walked away. He left Astrid behind in the spot she stood, without a look over the shoulder to check whether she was coming or not. But Astrid decided to ignore it, deciding to shrug it off as a mistake. It was an accident, he wasn't thinking. It's fine. She calmly tried to conclude, but her racing heart was giving her other ideas. What the hell was that, Haddock? Hiccup whispered sternly to himself, now out of earshot of Astrid. You guys were just getting back to normal, and then you had to go and pull that. He was stood by the car in the blazing sun, basking in its morning glory whilst waiting for Astrid, and scolding himself. He hadn't meant to peck her cheek like that, it was just an unconscious action that he had done out of reflex. But what could he do now? The deed was done, and the die had been cast. What more could be done? Hiccup. A feminine voice called out to him and woke him up from his embarrassed trance, and he gave her a warm smile. Astrid raised an eyebrow and smiled back. You ready to go, or are you gonna wait there all day? No, yeah. Let's go. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Morning, Hiccup. A chirpy, flirtatious voice called out to Hiccup as he was checking his phone whilst approaching the office. As he heard her voice, he looked up and came face to face with Heather. She had a bright smile on her face that seemed forced, and it made Hiccup frown. Hello, Heather. What's going on? He asked tentatively, putting his phone back in his pocket suspiciously as he kept his eye on Heather, who gave an odd sideways glance towards his office. Well. She started slowly, unsure how else to phrase it. I don't think you're going to like this. Taking in a deep breath and facing Hiccup strongly, she spoke up. You have a visitor, and it's not your father. It's your other one. Her last sentence made him freeze and his heart stop. She couldn't possibly mean him, could she? Hiccup gulped nervously and gave a hesitant, frightened smile over to Heather as he nodded her way. Thank you, Heather. Hiccup stuttered, unsure how to react to this news as a sense of anxiety sunk in. He couldn't possibly be here because he had uncovered Hiccup's plans, could he? He prayed to Odin that that wasn't the case. However, he strode towards his office door strongly and bravely and pushed it open with a sense of authority and pride. As the door swung open, he saw Thorold stood by the window, looking out onto the streets below, his hands held behind his back. He was facing away from Hiccup, so he didn't notice the flinch of fear on Hiccup's face as he noticed Thorold's presence in his office. But Thorold knew he was there. Lovely office you have here, he commented, still looking out the window. Great view. I know, you've told me before. Have I? Thorold began to turn around to look at Hiccup, his hands still behind his back. I can't remember. He gestured to the desk and its seats. Shall we sit? There's something I wish to discuss with you. Okay. Hiccup replied reluctantly, nervously making his way over to his chair behind the desk, only to find Thorold reaching to grab the chair at the same time. What are you doing? Oh, sorry. Thorold withdrew his hand and proceeded around the other side of the desk to take a seat. I'm usually the one in charge, and I'm not used to sitting on the other side of the desk. To a Hiccup. Well, then. You should have brought me to your office rather than coming here. Would have saved you time. Hiccup replied sarcastically, a small smile on his face as he realized he'd caught Thorold. Thorold's face momentarily dropped as he understood the truth of Hiccup's words, and knowing that he was right. Whatever, I'm not here to talk logistics of planning a meeting. Thorold cleared his throat and readjusted his position on the seat, sitting back and placing his hands onto his lap authoritatively. So, what did you come to talk to me about? Hiccup asked, however in his mind he was thinking, please not about Astrid. Please not about Astrid. Please not about Astrid. Anything but about Astrid. I know what you did. You do. Hiccup felt himself beginning to perspire. He couldn't possibly know about that. Could he? He wasn't at the cove as far as he was aware. And don't think you can get away with it. I know you think you're entitled to do it just because we're now family, but there is always a line you mustn't cross. And what is that line? The line where you're snooping around in my business with your father. Hiccup sighed, worried he'd have to admit to what happened with Astrid a few weeks ago. It's not your business to know what I plan to do, and it's not your business to collect private information about me and personal finances. You may think you have the right as coup. But you're nothing more than a daddy's boy, you're nothing without your father. Thorold began pointing at Hiccup very aggressively, his demanding figure starting to tower over Hiccup like a large building. He gulped at his father-in-law's height and shivered internally from fear. And if I don't stop? If I find the evidence I need to prove that you're blackmailing and bribing the people of the board to vote against my father in the next vote of confidence, what will you do? You'll be behind bars for fraud and bribery of officials. You'll become nothing. Hiccup seethed, a sudden surge of confidence rushing through his veins as he looked up to Thorold, not rising from his seat and staying firmly in his place. But Thorold began to laugh, leaning back in his seat letting out a hearty, intimidating laugh. Hiccup felt confused, raising an eyebrow at Thorold's behavior and crossed his arms over his chest quizzically. Thorold must have had something up his sleeve, especially if he was feeling so carefree and relaxed about this situation, because there was something he was not telling Hiccup. You think you alone are going to stop me? When I am so far ahead? He laughed again. You're much more of an idiot than I thought. Why is that? Because I have nothing to lose. He stood up and made his way over to the window, holding the authority as he went and keeping Hiccup's attention. You, on the other hand, have one thing to lose. Oh really? Hiccup leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, a disbelievable look spreading over his features. And what's that? What do you think I have that I could possibly lose? You know, I envy you. I do. Having something to lose like that, it's admirable. But at least it proves you're human. Thorold's tone lowered, his eyes focusing on Hiccup very closely. Is that so? How do you envy me then? I mean, it's not easy to ignore. To be in love with a girl who is also your enemy's daughter. Not sure how I would balance such a precarious situation. It could certainly affect the mind, perhaps impair judgment. You wouldn't dare. Hiccup seethed, the idea nauseating him. But Thorold just smiled, nodding his head as though he was agreeing to a mutual date. It didn't sit right with Hiccup, and he knew there was something wrong. But it was out of his control. Thorold was right. He did have something to lose, and Thorold knew exactly what it was. Oh, I would. But she's your daughter. I care nothing for the little runt. She's nothing more than a business deal between me and my wife, whom I married for money. Astrid was just a happy accident after a drunken night with her mother, not that it was consensual anyway. But I needed her money for my company, HTTYD, and her family was more than willing to help me after a little gentle persuasion. If Hiccup didn't want to punch and kill the guy before, he definitely wanted to now. I will gladly do whatever it takes to get what I want, and if that means hurting my daughter to hurt you. He chuckled. So be it. And then, he walked out of Hiccup's office without another word. But no other words needed to be said. It all was implied. Hiccup either had to be extremely careful or stop meddling in Thorold's business to save Astrid's life. Hiccup groaned loudly as he collapsed into his chair and let out a muffled scream as he placed his hands over his mouth to cover the sound. He hated how he just let Thorold win that battle like that, how he had basically laid down his sword without much of a fight. But Thorold was right. Hiccup had everything to lose. And that everything was Astrid. Chapter 41, Chapter 39. Chapter text. Morning, Heather. Astrid called out to Heather in a cheerful and slightly sarcastic tone, her cheerful words meaning to infuriate and annoy Heather as she approached her desk. Heather rolled her eyes at Astrid's appearance in the corridor, waltzing her way up to her desk as though she owned the place. Heather leaned back in her chair and folded her arms across her chest in a frustrated way. Meanwhile, Astrid managed to make it all the way up to Heather's desk and smiled at the secretary with a friendly smile, even if she didn't mean it. She wanted Heather to hate her more than she already does, because of Heather's crush on Hiccup. Astrid wanted to make her suffer. She stood in front of Heather's desk with her arms folded, almost the same as Heather's stance, and smiled. "Well, if it isn't the little wifey." Heather mocked, her words seethed through her teeth as she stared at Astrid as though she were the spawn of Satan. "And how are you doing, Heather?" Astrid asked, knowing that her friendly and innocent words would annoy Heather more. And they were. "Look, I know you think you're entitled to just wander around the building because you're married to the chairman's son. But listen here, miss. This is my domain, and nobody enters Hiccup's office without my authorization." Heather spat at Astrid, who continued to smile as though Heather's words had no impact on her. Which they didn't. "First, your father comes here to see Hiccup. And now you. You think you can just enter the office because you're family." Astrid's face dropped at Heather's words, the mention of her father causing her heart rate to accelerate rapidly as though she had just run a marathon. Her eyes went wide and her arms fell from her chest and down to her side, reaching forward to lean on Heather's desk. She looked down at the woman with a scared and worried look hidden behind her eyes. "My father was here?" she asked hesitantly, the words barely able to escape her mouth as she looked at Heather for confirmation. The secretary nodded informatively, not catching on to the fear and worry in Astrid's voice. "Yeah, this morning. He left a few minutes ago. I thought you would know that as his secretary." She scoffed, not believing that a girl this incompetent was married to the man she worked for. "Well, there are a lot of things my father doesn't tell me," Astrid muttered, leaving Heather confused at her words and furrowing her brow slightly. "I need to speak to Hiccup. It's urgent." Astrid pleaded, unwillingly. Heather laughed out loud, amused by the concept of Astrid begging her for something. She was loving it. The idea that such a woman, who was married to Hiccup, was asking and pleading with her to do something. Heather had the power, and she was going to abuse it. "I can't let just anyone in his office, you know. And to me, you're not someone special to him." "Well, then I guess that means that every girl he's ever slept with is not special to him," Astrid remarked, a small smirk on her face as she let the words sink in. But Heather just scoffed at Astrid's arrogance and rolled her eyes hysterically. "Don't try that with me. I know Hiccup's a virgin," Heather boasted, folding her arms across her chest, thinking she'd won. "Well, I mean, he was," Astrid admitted, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear as she reminisced on their night together. "He would never sleep with someone like you, you're nothing to him." Heather seethed, Astrid's words beginning to get to her. At that, Astrid outwardly laughed in Heather's face as the knowledge of her moment with Hiccup at the inn flashed before her mind. Heather didn't realize how special Astrid was to Hiccup's life, but neither of them would ever admit that. "I'm his wife, you selfish bitch," Astrid snapped, placing a hand over her heart in an innocent gesture that Heather didn't take seriously at all. "Try and enter if you dare then," Heather challenged, but underestimated Astrid's desire and need to talk to the man. Astrid whipped around Heather's desk and charged for the door, quickly followed by Heather. She grabbed onto the handle and wrenched the door open, Heather leaping towards her to close the door and bar her from entering. But she was too slow. Once Astrid had managed to open the door and enter, she closed it behind her and locked it from the inside. She laughed quietly to herself as she heard a groan and scream of frustration from the other side of the door until she heard someone clearing their throat behind her. The sound made her turn around and there she saw Hiccup sitting behind his desk, looking a little worse for wear, and sending Astrid a confused look. "What are you doing?" "I was, well, Astrid stuttered, unsure of how to talk to her husband after dashing into his office in the way she just had. "That desperate to see me, huh?" Hiccup joked as he smiled at Astrid's sudden nervousness. However, shaking her head of all her thoughts, Astrid strode over to Hiccup's desk and sat down on the seat in front of the desk. "It doesn't matter why I originally came here. How are you doing?" she asked curiously, a bright smile spreading across her lips. Hiccup smiled back and nodded, avoiding eye contact so as to not blush. "Well, I'm doing much better now that you're here," he replied shyly, avoiding her gaze. "But now that I think about it, why did you come here? Is there something you want to speak to me about?" Hiccup asked, cautious as to Astrid's reason for coming to his office. Did he need to be worried? "No, nothing. I guess, I just wanted to talk to you about my father." But someone told me that you have already spoken to him. Hiccup gulped, a sense of nervousness rushing through his veins as Astrid's words settled into his mind and he understood her meaning. She had heard about her father's visit, by Thorold or not, and she wanted to know what had been said. Could Hiccup admit that he had been blackmailed by her father? Or that he had threatened to kill her? He couldn't take the risk. He had to protect her. Yes, I have spoken to him. Although I didn't do much of the talking in comparison to him. He explained, leaning back in his seat to retreat away from Astrid. She gave him a quizzical look and leaned forward to get closer to him. Well. What did he say? Nothing, he just warned me not to go snooping around in his personal business. Hiccup shrugged, as though what he had just said hadn't mattered too much. By the way, Astrid looked up at him with a raised eyebrow, all attention on him. Have you ever heard of something called HTTYD? He asked reluctantly, wanting to know the answer but not sure whether he'd want to know once he found out. HTTYD? Hiccup nodded. Yeah, it was my father's old company. I mean, it went bankrupt just after I was born, I think. It was similar in business to your father's company, to this company. I believe that is why your father and mine had arranged this marriage such a long time ago. To eventually unite the companies and create one enormous label. Hiccup finished her thought. Exactly. But when it went bankrupt, my father turned to yours and managed to get a job here. Then he hired me as a secretary, and the rest is history. Astrid announced, concluding her story with a neat little bow, and Hiccup nodded in understanding. I didn't know your father had a company of his own before working here. I thought he got this job because of his connections to my father. Hiccup marveled. Well, now you know. Astrid shrugged before an uncomfortable silence filled the room and neither of them knew how to fill it. Their shallow breaths being the only things filling the space between them and their eyes looking everywhere but at each other. So. Hiccup stretched the word out as long as possible without being weird, the silence between them making him uncomfortable. I don't suppose you brought me a coffee on your way to see me, right? Hiccup asked curiously, a small joking smile spreading onto his face as he watched Astrid's face fall. Oh, gods. She slapped her forehead violently and shook her head sorrowfully. That's what I was supposed to bring. I forgot, I'm sorry. Astrid said, not looking up to Hiccup until she heard his voice. Hey, Astrid. She looked up and their eyes met. It's okay. I don't mind. So long as you're here, I'm feeling much better. Thank you. He smiled shyly and looked away, trying to focus on his papers in front of him again. However, it was very hard knowing Astrid's hard gaze piercing his skin. You're feeling better just because I'm here? She asked curiously, a hint of teasing behind her tone as she leaned forward and placed her head on her hands, cupping her cheeks gently as she gazed at Hiccup. Shut up, you know what I mean. Hiccup continued to look away, not daring to look at Astrid. But her gaze was becoming consistent and unavoidable. Do I though? What could you possibly mean by that? I enjoy your company. Hiccup finally met her eye, a serious look behind them as he stared at her. But she just stared back and didn't flinch from his sudden voice and piercing stare. Instead, she just smiled. I enjoy your company as well. Astrid replied, a small blush appearing on her cheeks, but she did nothing to cover them up. Astrid, you know I'd never do anything to intentionally hurt you, right? His question seemed sudden and serious, and Astrid's hands dropped back down onto her lap as she gave her husband a look of confusion. Yeah, I know. Well, then. Stop investigating your father. His words hung heavy in the air, unsure how to be absorbed and processed. So Astrid took them at face value. Why? If someone threatened you by threatening me, you'd do anything they said, right? Right. But as she replied she froze, understanding the meaning behind his words. She looked at Hiccup seriously, with sadness behind her eyes as they met. He threatened to kill me in order to get to you? She asked, a small choke in her voice as she asked. Hiccup nodded solemnly as Astrid let out a short sob, the realization of her father's desire to have Hiccup's company settling inside her. Astrid, I only want to protect you. I will do everything I can to protect you, but for now. My hands are tied. I need you and me to stop our investigation and lie low for a while. Until we can uncover some major piece of evidence, we basically have nothing. Hiccup explained. Astrid nodded along sadly with his words. Hiccup reached out and held out his hand across his desk for Astrid to take hold of, and she did. Promise me we will catch him and put him behind bars. I don't want him to hurt you, or your father. I promise. I will always protect you, Astrid. Always. Chapter 42, Chapter 40. Chapter text. It had been about an hour since Astrid had left his office, and Hiccup was starting to feel the crushing sensation he had begun to feel when Thorold was in his office. The feeling of defeat and being at a dead end were weighing down on him, and he wasn't sure what to do next. He was confused and scared. He was stuck. Suddenly, the phone rang. Its hollow, irritating ringing alerted Hiccup to its presence, and he felt the urge to pick it up on reflex. As he picked it up, the ringing stopped and he held it up to his ear in silence before realizing he needed to speak. "Hello?" he asked down the line, alerting the person on the other end that he had indeed answered the call. "Hello? Is this Mr. Haddock?" "Hiccup Haddock?" they asked coolly. However, Hiccup swore he heard a hint of nervousness as they spoke. He recognized the voice, but couldn't quite place it. "Yes, this is he. May I ask who is calling?" "Oh yes. This is Viggo, from the archives. And I think you'll want to come and see what I've found," he told Hiccup, his words insinuating that he had found a major breakthrough. But Hiccup was unsure what to do. Did he say to forget about it and put everything back? But the man must have worked very hard over the last couple of weeks to find this information. It couldn't hurt to take a look though. "Okay, Viggo. I'll come down in a few minutes." "Perfect. I'll be waiting." Then the line went dead as Viggo hung up the phone rather abruptly. Hiccup sighed heavily and placed the phone back onto its holder on the desk and leaned back in his chair, groaning at the tiredness of his muscles. Perhaps looking into something he had been working on for the past few weeks wouldn't cause too much trouble, especially if he was careful. But the thought of Astrid being hurt by her father because of him scared him the most. Hiccup loved Astrid enough to not want her to be hurt, but how much that meant he wasn't sure yet. Hiccup. A knock came at the door and it slowly swung open to reveal Heather's face standing there with a cup of coffee in her hands. She had that usual smile on her face and a welcoming look in her eye that made Hiccup frown in disgust. "What is it, Heather?" he asked frustratedly, annoyed by her presence and irritated by her arrival. He needed to leave and he couldn't tell her where he was going, so he had to be careful. "Well, I brought you a coffee." She set the coffee down on his desk with a flirtatious smile. "And I thought I'd let you know that you have nothing planned for the rest of the day." Hiccup nodded in understanding, his mind elsewhere and not focused on Heather's presence in his office. He knew she was saying something else as he was lost in thought, but he assumed she was probably trying to ask him out again, going by how she started the conversation. "So, if you wanted to head out early, could I invite you out for dinner? To celebrate your return as a married man?" Heather asked innocently, her proposal mysterious and unprompted. Hiccup couldn't help but furrow his eyes at the odd request. But Hiccup had no interest in her. It would feel like he was betraying Astrid and he didn't want to do that. So he blocked out her voice and thought about Viggo waiting for him in the archives. "Yes, I am a married man. And as a married man, I have to tell you that we are loyal to our husbands, even if an attractive young woman invites us to dinner," Hiccup replied stiffly, turning down Heather as strictly as he could. But when Heather smirked at his words and strode closer to him, he was sure she misunderstood his words despite their clarity. "You think I'm attractive?" she commented, smiling flirtatiously Hiccup's way. But Hiccup just rolled his eyes. He needed to go. "I said, if they did, and I don't currently see any attractive young women around here. So, I'm sorry Heather." He grabbed his coat off the back of his chair and grabbed his briefcase quickly as he headed for the door. "But I've got to go. It's urgent. Asterisk 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 asterisk." The race from his office down to the archives felt like a long one when in reality it probably only took him around 5 minutes. But Hiccup's heart was out of control the whole journey, his mind was racing and he could barely breathe as the elevator slowly trekked down to the archives. When they finally opened and Hiccup made his way down the dark, isolated corridor to the archives desk, his heart finally began to slow. Hiccup appeared before the desk to find it empty, and there was no one in sight. He thought Viggo would be there waiting for him, but he was wrong. There was a small bell sitting on top of the desk. It was dusty and clearly not well used, but Hiccup had no other options. So, with a small flick of his wrist, Hiccup gave the bell a quick ring and allowed the sound to fill the large, empty, silent space surrounding him. "Hello." A booming, intimidating voice sounded out as the last of the echoing sound of the bell diminished. Hiccup whirled around him, in search of the mysterious voice, and when he turned back to the desk he saw Viggo standing behind it, staring at him with a vacant look. "Hello, Viggo." Hiccup greeted, and Viggo just smiled at him. "You said you had something to show me." Hiccup was unsure of himself now that he was standing before Viggo, and he was starting to wonder whether this was an elaborate scheme that Thorold had set up to catch him in the act. But he had already threatened him, so what more could he possibly do to him? After a few moments of silence and stillness, Viggo nodded and turned around and back down the dark archive bookshelves that lined the room he was standing in. Hiccup knew there were thousands of papers and books and files filling the shelves, however, he never knew what was there and what was being recorded. "Here you go." Viggo slammed a large stack of documents onto the desk, only making his presence known by the noise the papers made when they hit the desk. Hiccup jumped back slightly and gazed at the stack curiously. "This is what you found?" Hiccup asked, furrowing his brow and pointing at the unusually large stack of papers. Hiccup had only expected a small file or two, but this stack of documents was at least 12 inches thick and had a proper weight to it. Viggo had to be wrong. "Yep. This is everything I could find on Thorold, especially on the stuff about his previous company HTTYD. Your father was a very thorough man when it came to his business deals, and you'll be surprised at what you find in there." Viggo explained happily, an eager smile spreading across his features as his gaze flicked between the documents and Hiccup. "Right." And just out of curiosity Hiccup looked around him for any listening ears. "No one followed you or investigated you?" He was wary and on edge, the threats from Thorold rattling his core as he knew the risk he was taking. "Hiccup." Viggo gave him a friendly smile that told him he was being a bit ridiculous. "I'm in charge of the archives here. No one investigates me. I'm basically like a retail employee, and no one really cares about them." He shrugged politely with a small smile on his face as he and Hiccup chuckled lightly at his joke. "I'm sorry, it was stupid of me to ask." "I'm just. Thorold caught on to you?" Viggo asked, with a look that suggested he knew what had happened despite it having happened just that morning. Hiccup gave him a confused look and tilted his head slightly to look better at Viggo. "Yes, how did you know?" Hiccup asked curiously, his hands reaching for the stack of documents carefully whilst maintaining eye contact with Viggo. "I know many things, Hiccup. You being not very discreet is one of them." Viggo shrugged with a nonchalant look across his face. It was the sort of look that made anyone want to punch him in the face, and Hiccup almost wanted to. But he refrained. "You think I'm not secretive? It's more that you're not as careful as think you are. In fact, by being careful you are drawing attention to the fact that you are probably doing something you shouldn't be." Viggo replied easily, a small shrug as he spoke. "But who am I to say?" He smiled and turned away, walking back into the shadows of the bookshelves. "What else do you know?" Hiccup asked curiously, and Viggo smiled back. "Do you want to know the answer to that?" "I mean, I could tell you everything I know about everyone who works in this building based on their records. However, we'd be here for hours, days even." Viggo joked, chuckling lowly at his words. But Hiccup ignored his words and shook off the uncomfortable feeling he had from Viggo's tone of voice. "Thank you, Viggo. Now, how am I gonna work through these?" Hiccup asked himself. "Why don't you ask your wife? Surely she'd want to catch the man who is threatening her life, right?" Hiccup looked up to try and spot Viggo in the shadows, but he was gone. The man had always been a mysterious presence in the archives, having always been there and having the kind of omniscient sense that made him slightly creepy. He always seemed to know everything and yet hated everyone. It's gonna be a long night. Chapter 43, Chapter 41. Chapter text. The ride home was quiet as Astrid sat in the car with Hiccup at the wheel, and neither of them spoke for the entire journey. Astrid wanted to speak but just couldn't work out what to say. She had gone to see him earlier that day for no particular reason, just to see him, and now she could barely speak to him. However, Hiccup was also uncharacteristically quiet. "Okay, Hiccup," Astrid announced as the car came to a stop in their driveway, the engine shutting off and the car going quiet. "Why are you being so quiet? Is there something bothering you? Was it something I said?" she asked, pleading with him to answer her roaring questions. She didn't know what else to think and her feelings were stirring up inside and they were starting to eat away at her. She just had to know. "Okay," Hiccup sighed, lowering his head to rest on the wheel of the car. "I've got a massive pile of paperwork to do, and it's about Thorold," Hiccup admitted sadly, not wanting to look over at Astrid as her mouth hung open in surprise. "What? I thought you said we should stop investigating him. And you made me promise not to do it too. Were you lying to keep me out of trouble?" Astrid accused, slightly offended by his words and her eyes widened in shock and offense by his answer. Hiccup turned to her in surprise and raised her hands in defense, shaking them wildly as he replied to her questions. He was afraid she would think that he was excluding her from his investigations when that was the opposite of what he wanted to do. "No, no, no. That's not what I meant. What I was going to say was that I couldn't work out how to ask you to help without sounding like I was begging. And without sounding like a complete hypocrite," he replied shyly, looking at her awkwardly as the words slipped out of his mouth. Astrid smiled at his words and a small blush appeared on her cheeks as she realized why he had been so quiet. And it was because of her. "It's okay, Hiccup. You don't need to be scared of me. If you need my help, I'm more than happy to help you. We're married after all." She smiled and hopped out of the car, making her way over to the front door and unlocking it. "Right, we're married," Hiccup mumbled to himself as he reached into the back of the car to collect his briefcase. As he exited the car, locking it with the key as he walked away, he glanced back over to the door to see Astrid waiting eagerly for him to arrive. The scene made a smile appear on his face. She looked beautiful. Shaking his head out of his thoughts, Hiccup joined Astrid by the door and made his way into their home with Astrid trailing him inside. Upon closing the door, Hiccup dropped his enormously heavy briefcase onto the floor and dashed towards the kitchen for a cup of coffee, needing it for the work that lay ahead of him. Astrid smiled to herself at his childlike behavior and picked up the briefcase. However, she only tried to. As her hand wrapped around the briefcase to pick it up, the resistance and weight of the case almost threw her back out as the weight was unbearable and almost impossible to lift. She tried to lift it once more but nothing. She could barely get it to lift even an inch off the ground. How the hell did he lift this thing? Astrid questioned herself as she looked at the seemingly light briefcase that was trying not to burst at the seams from the amount of paper stuffed inside of it. Astrid. Her name was called out from within the kitchen and caused Astrid to shrug and decide to leave the case alone. Walking into the kitchen, she saw Hiccup in his shirt and tie having taken off his blazer and he was standing over the coffee machine waiting for it to finish brewing. "What is it, Hiccup?" Her voice caught his attention and he whipped around to look at her with a smile. "Oh, I was wondering whether you wanted a coffee," he asked nervously, not expecting Astrid to have joined him in the kitchen. Instead of getting an immediate answer, there was a short pause as Astrid scanned Hiccup's body, gauging the size of his muscles as he looked at her for an answer. She couldn't work out how a man of his stature could lift such a weight. Or was she just getting weaker? She knew it couldn't be the last one, but she couldn't help but marvel at the reality of Hiccup's strength, hidden beneath that fishbone figure. "Astrid." Hiccup called out to her, finally snapping her out of her thoughts. "Yeah." Astrid looked up to him innocently, pretending that she hadn't just been checking him out. "Do you want a cup of coffee or not?" he asked again, less nervous and more curious. Astrid smiled and nodded in reply, causing a smile to spread infectiously onto Hiccup's face as well. "Yeah, I'd love one. I'm just going to get changed out of my work clothes and then I'll help you with that paperwork," Astrid announced before disappearing from the kitchen and racing up the stairs. ******************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** This is useless. Hiccup groaned and slammed his head against the coffee table that he was sitting in front of. His legs were hurting from sitting on the floor and his eyes were hurting from the vast amounts of writing he was having to read. Everything was a mess and the papers were strewn across the living room like a bomb had gone off and they were the lone survivors, him and Astrid. Hiccup, it's okay. Astrid comforted him as she sidled up beside him and carefully patted his back. But her comforting voice and calm gestures didn't do much to dispel his frustration. No, it's not Astrid. Hiccup countered, his head still collapsed onto the table and another heavy sigh exited his mouth quickly. We've been sat here for hours trying to read through this stuff and we've barely made a single breakthrough. I knew that Viggo guy was lying when he said there was something good in these papers. Hiccup threw another sheet of paper across the floor as he felt the urge to cry well up in his throat, his eyes beginning to tear up from the frustration and anger at the brick wall that they had hit. Hiccup. Astrid sighed, not knowing where she was going with her words and lowered her head. You're right. This is useless. She placed her head on the coffee table beside Hiccup, their heads facing one another as they lay on the coffee table. Hiccup's eyes met hers as their heads rested there, and he felt a familiar sense of butterflies and excitement as he lost himself in her eyes. But there was something else there that made him feel something different, something he had never felt when looking into Astrid's eyes. Was she scared? Why was he feeling sad? This whole thing is useless. There's no way that we'll be able to find anything about my father that can prove that he has been meddling with company funds or that he has been threatening and blackmailing board members, without their word for it. She raised her head off of the table and threw her head back to stare at the ceiling above them. We're stuck. Astrid complained loudly, her eyes welling up with tears as she stared at the ceiling. She hated this feeling of being lost, of feeling like the whole world was against her. This whole thing sucked. Astrid. Hiccup raised his head and looked over to Astrid with a soft expression, a small smile her way as he spoke. You weren't supposed to agree with me. The two of them burst into laughter, with Astrid's head finally lowering and looking over at Hiccup's as they beamed wide at each other. Astrid forgot about the pressure and the fear of the situation they were in as she looked into Hiccup's eyes, the brightness behind them melting away any worries she had been feeling. He was like her anchor to ground her. He kept her sane. Suddenly, the lights cut and the whole room fell into darkness and Astrid screamed. She leapt to the side of her where she knew Hiccup was and buried her face into his chest, gripping his clothes as tightly as she could as she felt her heart leap up into her throat and a sense of panic welling up inside of her. It turned out that the fearless Astrid Horferson wasn't as fearless as many thought. Astrid. It's okay, it's okay. I'm here. Hiccup cooed as he turned on his phone light and hovered it above Astrid's head, shining some light on her shivering figure. She slowly raised her head and looked up at Hiccup, still clinging to his shirt, and wore a bashful look on her face as she met his eye. She could barely see his face through the darkness, but she could just about make out the whiteness of his eyes. Hiccup smiled lightly and offered her a comforting and understanding look, which she melted at. I'm sorry. She muttered, looking away from Hiccup's intoxicating gaze for a moment to recompose herself. I'm not a massive fan of the dark. Hiccup giggled at her words and slowly stood up, handing her his phone torch. Wait here. Hiccup spoke softly, stepping over her figure and slowly heading for the door. Astrid looked after him in fear and tried to crawl after him. Where are you going? She asked, a slight panic in her voice as she looked at him desperately. Hiccup smiled at her expression, his heart melted as though he was looking at a puppy. He knelt in front of her and gave her a small kiss on the forehead. I'm going to get some more lights for us to see. I'll be back, I promise. He smiled and disappeared into the darkness. Astrid watched him go and her heart raced as her throat closed up. She hated the dark. Loathed its very existence. If she could choose anything about the world that she could change, it would be the existence of darkness apart from when people closed their eyes. Hiccup's absence was making her weary and she didn't realize how much she relied on his presence until he was gone, wandering around the house to find a few lights to light up the living room for her. She appreciated the sentiment but would have preferred he hurried up and didn't take so long. She was getting tired. After struggling through the darkness for about half an hour, Hiccup finally stumbled his way back into the living room with arms full of candles and a bag of batteries and lights to fix up the room. Finding his way inside, he saw Astrid asleep by the couch with the phone torch in her hand and lighting up the room. Hiccup smiled to himself as he saw the sight and knelt beside her sleeping figure to retrieve his phone delicately from her grip. "Rest, milady. It's okay," he whispered and made a start on hanging up all of the lights and lighting the candles in the room to light the place up like the 4th of July. It was going to be beautiful, he hoped. A few minutes later, Astrid's eyes fluttered open and the sight she was met with upon opening her eyes made the breath escape out of her lungs. The lights, although small, lit up the room in a bright, illuminative light that had her believing she was still in a dream. She noticed the fairy lights lining the table and the television in front of her, as well as the numerous candles dotted around the room. Soon her eyes landed upon a hunched figure lighting the last candle. He turned towards her and smiled lovingly at her before taking a seat beside her. "You're awake?" She nodded. "So, what do you think?" he asked proudly, gesturing to the lights that surrounded them and the candles flickering across the room. Astrid's face lit up and a bright smile spread across her lips. "I love it. Thank you." She hugged Hiccup tightly and snuggled her face into his neck. Hiccup hesitantly hugged her back and lightly patted her back with a gentle hand. "You're welcome," he responded quietly whilst lightly holding her in his arms. Astrid quickly came back to her senses and pulled away, slightly embarrassed about the way she had just flung herself at Hiccup and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her cheeks were blushing but not enough to cause a significant note and Astrid turned away from him to observe the whole room. "Well, what do we do now? How long is it gonna stay like this?" Astrid asked, curious about how long it was going to stay dark and peaceful. Hiccup sighed, giving her a light shrug. "Could be an hour, maybe 2. Could even be the whole night." "The whole night?" Astrid asked, slightly dumbfounded by his words, and he just chuckled. "Yes, the whole night. Have you never had a blackout before? Like the whole night?" Hiccup asked curiously, a small chuckle escaping his lips as he gazed at Astrid's face. She shook her head and shot him a curious look in response. "Are they a regular occurrence to you?" she asked, a bit disturbed by this fact knowing her fear. "I wouldn't say regular, but I've seen my fair share of blackouts before." "What did you do to pass the time?" Hiccup smiled at Astrid's question, pleased by her curiosity. Upon her words, he placed a mildly dusty set of Cluedo on the coffee table in front of them, the pieces inside the box shifting slightly and causing a small rattle as the box moved its way onto the table. Astrid furrowed her brow at the box and turned to Hiccup with a quizzical look. "Is this what you did? Played board games?" she asked, as though the very idea seemed ridiculous and stupid. Hiccup sighed and took the lid off of the box, beginning to set up the game as if Astrid had already agreed to it. "Well, I don't hear any other suggestions from you. And I'll have you know that some of my fondest memories of my childhood come from playing board games with my father during blackouts." Hiccup paused for a second. "Only because that was the only free time he had to play with me." Astrid saw the expression of happiness drop from Hiccup's face as he admitted the last few words, the sadness of the memories seeping back in and shaking his feelings. She felt bad for questioning such a fond activity, and she placed her hand upon his in comfort with a warm smile. He smiled back as their eyes met and she nodded. "I think it sounds fun. But you'll have to teach me how to play." "Of course I will." Chapter 44, Chapter 42. Chapter text. "Ha! I win again," Astrid announced proudly as the 3 cards were revealed. Hiccup sighed and threw them onto the Cluedo board in frustration and defeat, but smiled at Astrid's victorious little dance. "Do you have to do that every time?" he asked as a small chuckle left his lips, watching her shimmy in the silent dark of the living room they were currently sitting in. She smiled at him and stuck out her tongue at him as she continued to dance on the spot. "Yep. 'Cause I know it annoys the hell out of you." Astrid chuckled as she watched Hiccup's face twist and turn, unsure what emotion to portray. All right," he admitted defeat and held his hands up in surrender, causing Astrid's movements to slow to a halt. She continued to smile like an idiot, but her victorious dance had stopped and she was sat waiting for another game. "Another game?" she asked, beginning to gather up the cards and shuffle them for another go. Hiccup sighed and lowered his head, shaking it gently as he didn't want to lose another game to Astrid again. And lose to you again. No thanks. How about we play something different? Hiccup suggested, holding up a pack of you-know cards with a mischievous smile on his face, a hidden secret residing behind them that made Astrid feel excited and uneasy. You know. Yes, but I was thinking we do things a little differently. Well, what did you have in mind? Astrid asked hesitantly, the mysterious look in Hiccup's eye only growing with every second he was staring into her own eyes. But his smile dispelled any feeling of fear or anxiety she might have had. Instead, she felt safe and intrigued by his idea. We have a bet. Best out of 3. Whoever wins 3 games, gets a wish that they have to complete tonight. Hiccup announced, proud of his idea. His chin darted up slightly as the words exited his mouth, and Astrid couldn't help but smile at the action. He looked like a proud child, and it was adorable. So, the wish can't be something a few days from now or something. Is that what you mean? Astrid asked, a look of intrigue and excitement behind her eyes as she looked over to Hiccup with a mischievous smile. Hiccup nodded enthusiastically and smiled brightly as Astrid asked about his idea, knowing that she was getting on board with it. Exactly, and the wish has to be a punishment for the other person. Like I could say my wish is for you to call up your father and tell him you're pregnant. Hiccup gave an example, but those words sent a shockwave of panic through Astrid's body, the idea scaring her even more than the thought of actually doing it. I'm not suggesting that you do that, in fact, that was a bad example. Hiccup rubbed the back of his neck nervously, realizing he had made Astrid uncomfortable with his words. It's okay, Hiccup, Astrid comforted, although the anxiety hadn't fully left her body. I got it, I understand the premise. Let's just get started, shall we? She suggested, gesturing to the pack of cards in his hand that he was nervously shuffling around within his hands. Hiccup nodded and began to deal out the cards and begin the game. The game went on for seemingly hours, their focus completely on the game in front of them as they placed card after card in the middle. There were some laughs and some outraged screams as either had to draw 12 cards from the deck in one go. But overall, the atmosphere was peaceful, it was easy. Ha! I won! Hiccup cheered, but Astrid scoffed and rolled her eyes as she collected the cards off of the table and began shuffling. Calm yourself. I'm still beating you by 2 points. I could still win this wish, you know. Astrid countered with a sly smile as she dealt out the cards between her and Hiccup. Hiccup smiled back and collected up his cards once the table was set and raised an eyebrow at his cards. Well, I think we both have 2 points now, don't we? It's match point. Whoever wins this match, wins the wish. Hiccup smirked, placing the first card from the deck into the middle of the table with a final slam. Good luck. He smirked and watched Astrid's eyes momentarily quiver. Game on. Astrid announced as she placed a card from her deck on top of Hiccup's with a proud smile. However, the game went on longer than the two had realized after having to reshuffle the deck a few times mid-game to keep the stock of extra cards fresh. Astrid let out a huge sigh as Hiccup placed another card into the middle of the table, the fire and excitement in her body dying out as the minutes ticked by. Hiccup looked up towards Astrid as he heard her sigh and sent her a quizzical look with his brow furrowed. What's up? He asked as he watched her select a card from her set and place it carelessly onto the cards in the middle of the table. It's just that this game has been going on longer than I had expected it to, Astrid admitted sadly, resting her head on her hand and watching for Hiccup's next move. I know what you mean, he placed another card. It feels as though we've been playing this game for hours and still we keep coming back to where we started. Kinda sounds like our entire relationship. Astrid joked, a light smile dusting across her face as she placed another card on the table. What do you mean? Hiccup asked as a soft chuckle escaped his lips. Well, Astrid shrugged nonchalantly. No matter what happens between us, whether we kiss or sleep together figuratively or literally, we always arrive back to what we were at the start. Two people who would rather be in any other situation than the one we're currently in. She concluded as she watched Hiccup slowly and hesitantly place a card onto the table. Is that what you think? That we both would rather not be in this situation at all? You would? Her question caught him slightly off guard, but looking back he should have expected it. I mean, I wouldn't class it as the total disaster scenario you are, but it's not ideal. Exactly, it's not ideal. Therefore, why would anyone choose to be in this situation? I know, why would they? Hiccup muttered to himself as he placed another card on the table with a soft touch, allowing the card to float onto the table gently. Astrid watched his actions and looked concerned as she took a card from the spare deck and waited for Hiccup to take another turn. What? Was it something I said? No, no. It's just. I was. Hiccup sighed, unsure how to phrase his feelings fully without it being weird between the two of them. This whole situation was kind of like my childhood fantasy. Hiccup admitted shyly, a small blush dusting his cheeks as the words left his mouth. What? Having an arranged marriage with a girl you've only ever met once before? Astrid asked with a short scoff at the end of her words. Hiccup shrugged and turned away from her, unwilling to look her in the eyes as she put a sarcastic, insulting tone to her words. You see, when you put I like that, it sounds kinda stupid. Hiccup admitted, scratching the back of his neck nervously as he placed another card on the table. I think that's the only way to put it. Well, regardless, I just thought that this whole push and pull relationship of an arranged marriage was something I had always wanted to experience. I wanted to know what it was like to have a girl swoon at my actions that barely meant anything to everyone else. I wanted to make a girl fall for me in a way that was completely me. You know. And I just wanted to know what it was like to be married. It was my one promise to my mother, and I feel like I let her down. I win, Astrid announced solemnly as she placed her final card down on the table, her empty hands now obvious to the absent-minded Hiccup. His eyes widened momentarily before he threw his deck of cards onto the table in defeat. Well, that was anticlimactic. Hiccup groaned as he collapsed his face onto his hand that was propped up on the coffee table, a frown stretched across his features. What do you mean? Astrid looked at him in shock and disappointment. I won. Astrid reaffirmed, but Hiccup didn't look any more enthused about her victory than before. What do you want me to say? Yeah. Hiccup shot her a quizzical look before sending a short shrug. It doesn't matter anyway. What's your wish? Hiccup asked apathetically, wanting the night to be over quickly, but Astrid just smiled devilishly. Now. I don't want to waste this opportunity to do something basic. I have to think about this. Astrid pondered, placing her hand on her chin and stroking it dramatically as the cogs began to whir in her head. Hiccup rolled his eyes at her actions and hunched himself over the table whilst he waited. Come on, Astrid, Hiccup chuckled as he watched her thinking face, the expression he could only describe as adorable and cute, both meaning the same. But Astrid just smiled and continued to think in silence. I can guarantee during this time, you haven't thought of a single thing. True. But, I'm just waiting for a spark of inspiration to hit me, Astrid announced, smiling brightly and returning to look at Hiccup across the coffee table. He met her gaze and found himself drowning in her sea blue eyes, the color magnetizing him. All right then, what should we do whilst we wait for your spark of inspiration? Hiccup asked, sarcastically using air quotes around the word spark of inspiration, as a joke. Astrid rolled her eyes and laughed along with his words. How about we play Never Have I Ever? Astrid suggested, but Hiccup groaned and rolled his eyes dramatically. Oh come on. That is the most cliched party game there is, less so than Truth or Dare. But still. Hiccup complained, sighing heavily at the idea but also realizing that there was nothing else to do in the blackout. It'll be fun, Hiccup. I know a lot of questions to ask. Astrid said excitedly, a huge grin spread across her face as she linked her fingers together suggestively. Hiccup chuckled and rolled his eyes at her actions and slowly stood up. I'll go get the alcohol then, shall I? Exiting the living room, Hiccup entered the kitchen to fetch a bottle of alcohol and a couple of glasses to go with it. Whilst Astrid waited, she tried to think of a wish to ask for. But no matter how many times she tried to come up with a good wish, she would cast it aside, telling herself that it was stupid and useless. Hiccup quickly returned and passed Astrid a full cup of alcohol and poured himself one as well. Taking a quick swig from the glass, Hiccup looked over to Astrid, who seemed lost in thoughts, and Hiccup had to wave his hand in front of her face to snap her out of it. Astrid. Do you want to start? Hiccup asked, a questioning eyebrow raised as Astrid shook herself awake and smiled over at Hiccup. Right, yes. Of course. She readjusted her seat on the floor and cleared her throat. Okay, let's see. Never have I ever had a crush on someone who was much older than me. Neither of them took a sip and both stared at each other unblinkingly during the moment of silence between them. Hiccup smiled as Astrid smiled with him, neither of their glasses raising at the question. I mean, it depends on how much older is. But I wouldn't say I have. Hiccup admitted confidently. Astrid smiled in response and gestured towards him. Your turn. Right. Never have I ever been caught looking at something I shouldn't have. There was a brief pause. Then Astrid took a sip. Really? What were you looking at? What do you think I was looking at? Astrid gave him a dumb look. But Hiccup tilted his head in confusion, wanting her to elaborate anyway. Someone sent me nudes, and I was looking at them whilst at work and I was caught by someone at the company. They don't work there anymore so it's not awkward, but I'm still grateful that they didn't tell my father. Astrid admitted, clearly not affected by the memory that much. Okay, interesting. Who were the nudes from? Do you really want to know the answer to that? Hiccup paused and thought for a moment. Probably not. Next question. Never have I ever faked something for a relationship. Neither of them drank. Until Astrid did. Let me guess. Pleasure. In the bedroom? Hiccup asked, and Astrid smiled with a curt nod of confirmation. Of course, what else? Okay, my question. Never have I ever refused a kiss. Both of them drank. How many girls have you rejected, Hiccup? Astrid asked scandalously, although in a joking way. Hiccup chuckled and shook his head. Trust me, not as many as you may be imagining. All right, I'll trust you. Astrid eyed him for a few seconds before casting her mind back to the game. Okay, never have I ever had a one-night stand. Both of their glasses stayed still. Really? You've never had a one-night stand, Astrid? Hiccup asked, slightly surprised by that fact. I mean, there was that almost one in college. But no, I don't think I've ever had one. Astrid thought back, but couldn't recall any bad decision one-night stands in her past. So her glass stayed still. Your question, Hiccup. Right. Never have I ever lied to someone that I'm in a relationship so that they'll stop hitting on me. Both of them drank. Okay, now I'm slightly jealous, Astrid admitted quietly, allowing her glass to muffle her words. Never have I ever fantasized about someone I'm not in a relationship with. Hiccup drank. Astrid wanted to take a sip but felt conflicted. She didn't drink. Really? Just me? Come on, Astrid. There has to be at least one. Hiccup questioned, slightly embarrassed about being the only one who drank. No, I can't really think. I don't think I've ever fantasized about someone. Maybe dreamed, but no fantasy. Astrid corrected a small blush on her cheeks from the alcohol and the embarrassment. Okay, never have I ever felt attracted to somebody I never thought I would be after I first met them. Hiccup downed the rest of his drinks and filled it up again. There hadn't been that many questions, and in fact, neither of them had drunk on all of the questions. But both of them were feeling the alcohol beginning to hit them. Hiccup more so. Astrid hesitantly took a drink from her glass and extended it towards Hiccup for a refill. Let me guess, it was that Kristoff guy? Hiccup asked rather spitefully, a small scoff at his words as he spoke. Astrid shot him a confused and odd look, puzzled by his sudden change of tone. Hiccup, what's gotten into you? Why are you so upset all of a sudden? It's nothing. I'm just frustrated, I guess. Annoyed. Hiccup admitted, taking a long sip of his glass and wondering over his words for a few seconds. I didn't mean to bring that up, I'm sorry. I know that he's just your friend, I'm just being touchy. I know, but why? Astrid asked, moving herself to sit beside him on the other side of the coffee table where he was sitting. She snuggled beside him in the tight space between the couch and the table, with very little space to move. Hiccup let out a long sigh and lowered his head, feeling slightly ashamed by his next words which were propelled out of his mouth by the alcohol. Because I feel like I'm the only one in this relationship that isn't ashamed of what we do. I'm not ashamed or embarrassed every time we kiss, and I certainly don't regret that night at the inn. In fact, that's what I keep fantasizing about. It's what I keep dreaming about. That night. Hiccup reminisced, the memory hazy from the alcohol, but the feeling was still there. I want to remember that night. All I can remember is the feeling, but I want to know more. Then I wish for you to remember, Astrid muttered, the words falling from her lips before she could fully realize their meaning. Astrid, I'm not a genie. I can't fulfill that wish at this moment, nobody can. I mean, maybe the gods, but I'm not a god. Hiccup rambled, uncomfortable with the situation he had caused between them, regretting opening his mouth. Until Astrid kissed him. His rambling words stopped and his mouth was glued against Astrid's as she pulled his face close and smashed their lips together like two puzzle pieces. And it felt right. Hiccup cupped Astrid's face and began kissing her back, feeling the power and passion behind her movements as she pushed and pulled against his actions. It was bliss. When they finally pulled away from each other, they were both panting from the lack of air and their faces were flushed red. Astrid met eyes with Hiccup and let out a soft chuckle, placing her hands on his shoulder gently with a soft touch and an exhausted smile. You talk too much. You know that. Chapter 45, Chapter 43. Chapter text. Hiccup was finishing tying his tie and had just tightened it up. All the buttons of his shirt were done up properly despite his wandering mind. It had been a few days since the blackout, and neither of them had mentioned anything about the kiss or the wish. It was a silent matter between the two of them, and not one word had been spoken about it. But Hiccup hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. It was becoming a distraction, and Hiccup would much rather forget that it had happened and move on. They had done it before, so why couldn't he do it now? Nothing was different about that kiss, maybe the pretense that Astrid wanted Hiccup to remember about their night together. But other than that, it was just like their other kisses. So why was it wandering around his mind like an annoying mosquito? This is driving me crazy. Hiccup sighed, brushing a hand through his hair in thought and frustration. He didn't care much about his appearance, it was only a work event, but he knew Astrid would care. The two of them, in their separate rooms, were getting ready for a work event. It was much like any work event, people dressed up nicely and mingled between the crowds before eventually returning home. There was no dinner and no seating arrangements. It was just an open bar at a large banquet hall that had been rented out. Hiccup was asked to attend, and Astrid would be expected to come with him. It would be the second event that they would be attending together where they had to look like a couple. Hiccup was nervous about the event, not because of how he had to act around Astrid, but because of how he was going to act. Was he going to make everything weird between them? He hoped not. Exiting his room, he noticed Astrid's door was still closed and he strode right over to it and knocked gently on her door. He heard her voice call from inside, although he couldn't hear exactly what she said, so he remained outside of the room. Astrid, I'll wait downstairs for you. Take all the time you need. Hiccup called into the room, the door still closed and the hardwood making the conversation slightly awkward for him. He heard shuffling and grunts coming from inside the room, his brow furrowed as he tried to strain his ears more to the noises coming from within. He heard Astrid say something, but because of the door, it wasn't clear. Soon, the door swung open, and Astrid was revealed on the other side. Hiccup was slightly alarmed by the sudden movement and took a step back away from the door. Astrid sighed heavily and looked at him with a helpless look, a look that made Hiccup's heart feel heavy. Hiccup. Could you help me? Astrid asked sadly, clearly not wanting to ask him but knowing it was her last resort. Hiccup gave her a sad smile with a confident nod and followed her inside the room. What do you need help with? Hiccup asked awkwardly. He stopped in the middle of the room and took the time to look around the place, having never really stepped foot inside a girl's room before a party. The room was a mess. There were clothes on every surface, some undergarments were strewn across the floor and some makeup on the table that looked as though it was on its last legs. Hiccup scowled at the table full of makeup, not liking the idea of Astrid wearing a lot to further pronounce her beauty. For Hiccup, she didn't need to look more beautiful than she already was. Could you help me with this dress? Astrid asked, gesturing to the undone zip down her spine that her small arms couldn't reach. It was clear that she had tried to reach the zip herself, but had too much trouble and needed help. Of course, Hiccup muttered quietly, hesitantly making his way over to Astrid's back and carefully grabbing the zip. As he zipped up the dress, he could feel Astrid's soft skin beneath his fingers as he made his way up the dress. The hairs on her back tickled his fingers and her skin seemed to tense beneath his touch. Was he making her uncomfortable? Or was there some other reason for her reaction? Once the zip reached the top, Hiccup pulled his hands away and smiled. "There, done," he announced proudly. Astrid smiled and turned around to face him, only to see his expression falter as his eyes fell on the dress. Hiccup's mouth went dry as his eyes scanned the dress that Astrid had adorned. Earlier he hadn't taken much notice of what she was wearing, but now that she was in front of him in a dress like that, it was hard not to look at her. To Hiccup, she looked like an angel and she shone brighter than the world's brightest star. Hiccup felt blinded by her beauty and felt honored to call her his. "Wow!" Hiccup breathed, finally able to spit a word out from his dry mouth. Astrid blushed at his word. It was only a breath, but it was enough to tell her he liked the dress. "Does it look okay?" she asked hesitantly, trying to gauge Hiccup's face for a worthy expression. Hiccup smiled and pulled her close, their faces inches apart. "Okay. It looks amazing," Hiccup complimented, a bright smile spreading across his face as he looked upon her beauty for the umpteenth time. "You look like an angel," Hiccup sighed, still enraptured by the dress. "Thank you," Astrid replied shyly, tucking a small piece of hair behind her ear and placing that hand onto his chest as she continued to look away. There were a few moments of silence between the two of them, their eyes locking into a deadly duel as neither one could look away. Hiccup felt his body wanting to move on its own, desperate to dive down and steal a kiss. Whereas Astrid wanted to throw her arms around Hiccup's neck and forget about the work event and redo their night at the inn. She wanted that moment again. "Why do I keep wanting to kiss you?" Hiccup asked out loud, his words mumbled but audible to Astrid, who was standing directly in front of him. Her eyes went wide and she shot him a surprised look, not pushing him away and not getting any closer to him. "What?" she asked in surprise, a soft, uncomfortable chuckle escaping her lips. "Why is it that whenever we are alone together, and we are just that little bit too close, we end up kissing?" Hiccup questioned, his curiosity being subdued by his desperate gaze upon Astrid's lips. "And then we stop talking to each other afterwards. Are you that ashamed that you kissed me?" Astrid froze, their eyes meeting and locked together as she looked up towards him. Hiccup held a sad but mournful look behind his eyes as he looked down at Astrid, wondering whether he had hit the nail on the head. "No. No." Astrid finally managed to speak, her mouth working and uttering the words she was desperately trying to say. Hiccup raised an eyebrow, not fully believing her response. "That's not at all why I do that. It's because..." She let out a soft sigh, momentarily breaking eye contact and dropping her gaze to the floor. "I feel like I wouldn't be able to hold myself back. I don't want to tempt the devil." Hiccup couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face, a bright beating smile plastered upon his lips as he watched Astrid's cheeks blush. Pulling herself from his embrace, Astrid wandered over to her dresser and grabbed her bag, waltzing her way past Hiccup with a cold shoulder, clearly wanting to forget about what had just been said. "I'll be waiting in the car. Let's just get this thing over with." Asterisk 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 asterisk. "You look beautiful, don't worry," Hiccup whispered into Astrid's ear as they made their way up the steps into the grand hall where the work event was taking place. Hiccup had noticed Astrid getting a bit nervous in the car, so as they left he had interlocked their arms and strode up the steps alongside her. He kept her close all the time, his grip on her arm almost vice-like. "Thanks," Astrid mumbled a reply, but as the doors opened and the wave of noise hit them, her words were lost in the wind. Astrid gripped tighter onto Hiccup's arm as he led her into the party and up to his father, who was also approaching them with open arms. "Hiccup," Stoic announced, greeting his son in a warm hug and tearing him away from Astrid's grip. Hiccup felt his lungs collapsing under the strength of Stoic's hug, and once he was released he was left panting in his place for a few seconds. "Thanks, Dad. Nice to see you too," Hiccup greeted, his voice a little hoarse from the intense hug he had just gone through. Astrid found his overreaction cute and couldn't help but giggle at him. "Oh, and hello to you, Astrid." Stoic greeted them with a warm, welcoming smile, a smile that managed to dispel any fear that Astrid was experiencing. She smiled back and nodded his way in recognition, knowing that they weren't up to hugging each other just yet. "Hello, Stoic." Astrid greeted back. However, their greetings were cut short and rudely by a loud, obnoxious voice that instantly filled Astrid's blood back up with anxiety and stress. Her eyes fell upon the figure of her father making his way through the crowd with a wide, drunken smile. It was clear that he had a few drinks and was already quite drunk by the time the young couple had walked through the door. Astrid knew this could only end in disaster. "Astrid." Her father greeted loudly, turning more than a few heads their way much to Astrid's displeasure. Thorold threw his arms around his daughter and continued to rest one of his arms over her shoulders. "And Hiccup, too," he mentioned spitefully, his teeth gritted and the words spat through them. "Hello to you too, Thorold." Hiccup replied with as much spite and hatred as Thorold had given him. Thorold smiled and nodded Hiccup's way, his actions drunken and without much thought as he pulled Astrid closer to him. "I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to need my daughter for a while. It's purely business, I assure you." However, his voice implied that there was more to it than that. Stoic smiled and nodded, but Hiccup seemed reserved and hesitant about his reply. "Of course, she's your daughter and secretary, after all, Thorold. Besides, I wanted to talk to Hiccup privately as well." Stoic wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, beginning to pilot him away from Astrid and her father. The couple locked eyes and tried to maintain it as they were forced away from each other, their longing looks spreading across the grand hall until they were lost in the crowd. Astrid didn't know who her father was taking her to see, but she knew it couldn't be good. The crowd parted as Thorold led Astrid toward his destination. A few curious glances were passed their way as they made their way through the crowd. People looked at Astrid with admiration, others looked upon her with jealous eyes as they looked upon her beauty. But she kept walking, her father's grip upon her figure growing tighter with each step. "Well, well, well. There you are, Thorold." A hearty, manly voice called out as Thorold parked himself and Astrid in front of a large, ugly-looking man. Astrid recognized him as one of the board members. He had quite a lot of influential power on the board, and if was on the good side of Thorold, who knows what he would do for him. "Ah. Alvin. Lovely to see you here. I've brought my daughter along to say hello, she's also my secretary," Thorold introduced, with a slight hint of innuendo and secrecy to his tone. Astrid ignored it and smiled politely at the large man in front of her. He returned a slightly disturbing smile back. She did not like the look of the man in front of her. There was something more than met the eye with these two. "Oh, I see." Alvin looked over Astrid as though she were a piece of meat or a horse that he was preparing to buy for the races. Did she have the structure to handle the future ahead of her under his rule? "Your father tells me that you have quite a lot of experience," Alvin commented, the words oozing innuendo and filth. Astrid felt sick upon hearing his words, but she could do nothing but stand there and listen. "Yes." Astrid replied hesitantly, unsure where the conversation was going. She wondered whether there was a secret secondary conversation that she was missing and the men were talking about. Alvin smiled devilishly at her words, liking what he was hearing, which displeased Astrid. "I mean, she sure is beautiful. Such a rare specimen to find these days. Usually, by their age, they've seen too much, if you catch my meaning." Alvin replied, his words more targeted at her father than Astrid. But they made Astrid uncomfortable as she began to understand their implications. "Oh, trust me. You don't have to worry about that. She hasn't seen too much these last couple of years, so she's probably recovered from her past experiences," Thorold mentioned, seeming pleased by her lack of experience over the years as he explained it to Alvin, whose smirk only seemed to widen with each word uttered by her father. "You are right there, Thorold. It would be a waste to pass this opportunity and let it slip away." Alvin slowly placed his hand on Astrid's shoulder, stroking the skin there as though he was about to pounce on her. Astrid felt her body stiffen up and she froze, unable to move away. Her father's tight grip on her arm kept her in place, no matter how much she wanted to run away. "So, we have a deal?" Thorold asked, an evil smirk covering his face as he looked over at Alvin. The two shared a nod and a wink, and Thorold let go of Astrid's arm and disappeared into the crowd. Alvin gripped Astrid's waist and pulled her close, his grip strong and unbreakable as he leaned closer to her ear. "Let's go somewhere more private to talk. Shall we?" His whispering into her ear made her shiver as his warm breath stung her skin. Astrid wanted to run, but his grip on her waist was making it impossible. She could only beg that Hiccup would come to save her. "Hey!" A masculine, broad figure came to stand in front of Alvin, blocking his path. The man was clearly a lot smaller than Alvin, and a lot less strong. However, the way the man carried himself was enough to make many heads in the room turn towards the commotion and watch in fascination. Astrid met eyes with her savior and looked upon those familiar emerald eyes she knew very well. "Hiccup!" She whispered aloud, a small sigh escaping her lips as she looked upon his figure. He was trying to look big and brave in front of the large, muscular man in front of him. But Alvin's size only made his efforts look like those of an immature kid. "What do you want, little boy?" Alvin spoke down to the young haddock, his eyes piercing into Hiccup's flesh as they met eyes. "I want you to take your hands off my wife." Hiccup shouted loudly, his voice booming across the room for all to hear. Alvin rolled his eyes but noticed the disgraced and disappointed looks he was being given by everyone in the room. His actions were despicable, and Hiccup had just brought attention to them. "Fine." Alvin threw Astrid towards Hiccup, who collapsed into his arms willingly. "She's not all that worth it anyway," he seethed, wallowing away in defeat and disappearing to the crowd. "Why that?" Hiccup wanted to storm away and confront him, but a small tug on his suit from Astrid made his attention focus elsewhere. "Just leave him. He's not worth it." Hiccup smiled down at Astrid as she soothed his anger in seconds. Her words were cliched and gentle but were enough to dispel his anger. "Come on," he wrapped an arm around her waist and pinned her to his side. "Let's go get a drink. I'm not letting you out of my sight again." Chapter 46, Chapter 44. Chapter text. The night continued, and after the events with Alvin, Hiccup never let Astrid out of his sight. Which often made it difficult for her to go to the bathroom, however, he was always convinced to wait outside. Hiccup had his arm stuck to her waist, pulling her close every second he got and never allowing her to stray from his sight. At first, Astrid had found his behavior cute and heroic, however, as the party dragged on and the hours passed, his grip upon her waist was becoming tiresome and heavy. Astrid often tried to pry his hand off of her waist, but this was often a fruitless endeavor. As Hiccup dragged Astrid along with him to another group of co-workers, Astrid was becoming increasingly agitated by Hiccup's constant grip upon her waist. So, when they arrived at the group, Astrid finally managed to pry herself out of Hiccup's grip and stand beside him without his vicious grip on her body. "Hello, guys. You know Astrid, right? My wife." Hiccup introduced Astrid, making sure to emphasize the wife part of his sentence. He gestured her way with an open hand and a bright smile. Astrid shyly waved back as the boys sent her friendly smiles and cheery waves. "Hello, it's nice to meet you," Astrid replied, waving shyly at the men in front of her. They smiled back and one stepped forward to take her hand in a professional handshake. "Hello, my name is Jack. It's nice to meet you too. I've heard a lot about you." Jack took a sideways glance towards Hiccup with a knowing look and mischievous smile. Hiccup glared at his friend with a warning look, but Jack didn't seem to be much affected. "Yes, it's lovely to meet you after so long. It seems like forever since you two got married." Another voice perked up. Astrid met eyes with the man who had just spoken, and he seemed to be smiling brightly although his eyes held a different emotion than his face. Astrid nodded in recognition and smiled brightly. "I know, it has been a long time. Almost 6 months now, right?" Astrid asked Hiccup, turning to him momentarily as she spoke. Hiccup smiled down towards her with a loving look and nodded. "Probably seems a lot shorter to you too," Jack joked, giving Astrid a short nudge in the arm suggestively. Blushing in response, Astrid tucked a piece of hair behind her ear as the thought of their night together at the inn flashed into her mind. However, Hiccup noticed her movements and blushing cheeks and felt a surge of jealous rage seep into his skin. No one was allowed to make Astrid squirm and blush other than him. He was supposed to be the only person in the world who could cause such an effect in Astrid's body, and the idea that someone else had been able to do it made him angry. But he stayed calm despite the raging anger swirling inside of him. Yeah. How's it been since you got married? Been leaving many broken hearts in your wake? Another man suggested with a chuckle. The other boys laughed along. However, Hiccup and Astrid remained silent. Astrid tilted her head and furrowed her brow. I'm afraid I don't follow. I mean, Jack piped up, taking over from the guy who originally commented. A pretty girl like you. No doubt there would be many broken hearts after they take one look at your hand. At those words, he took Astrid's hand into his and raised it to gesture at the ring that rested there. Hiccup's burning rage within him was about to erupt as he saw Jack take Astrid's hand into his own. Touching the skin that belonged to him, feeling the warmth of her body that Hiccup loved. Everything about her was his to know, and for everyone else to imagine. Oh, Astrid withdrew her hand and swatted at the air in a flustered state, a shy smile on her face as she blushed at the compliment by the three young men. I don't think I'm that pretty. Really? Have you not looked in the mirror? One of the men asked, gesturing at Astrid standing in front of them. Yes, and I don't think I'm as beautiful as you think I am. Well, I guess someone doesn't make you feel as loved as you deserve. Jack smiled evilly, his gaze locked onto Hiccup's as the words fell from his mouth. Hiccup felt his anger boil over and in a frustrated rage, he grabbed Astrid's hand and began pulling her away. Come on, Astrid. We're going home. He announced angrily, his hand gripping her arm tighter with every step. Astrid could do nothing but allow him to drag her away from the party in a sudden departure. Waving goodbye to the men she was talking to, Astrid followed Hiccup out of the party and towards their car in the parking lot. Hiccup. What is wrong with you? Astrid asked frustratedly, her voice shrill and annoyed as Hiccup shoved her into the car. Just get in. He seethed, his words urged out through gritted teeth as he slammed the door behind her. Astrid felt herself shrink into her seat as Hiccup got in the car on the other side and started driving away and back home. The whole drive was tense and hot. Astrid had never seen Hiccup so angry before, and the way he was gripping the steering wheel was turning his knuckles white. Astrid didn't want to admit it, but she found Hiccup's anger quite attractive and hot. However, she didn't say a word and just quietly admired him from her seat and fearfully kept her mouth shut. Soon, they were pulling into their driveway and Hiccup left the car quicker than ever, slamming his door behind him and storming over to the front door. Astrid was barely able to keep up with him as she had to run after him to catch him in the hall. However, as soon as she entered their house and closed the door behind her, she came face to face with a very angry-looking Hiccup. His brow was furrowed and his fists were clenched tighter than they were in the car. Astrid gulped and her eyes shook in fear of the man before her. So, did you enjoy flirting with those men right in front of your husband? Hiccup asked accusingly, causing Astrid to take a small step back. His voice sounded as though he was about to start yelling, and Astrid didn't want to be around when he exploded. What are you talking about? I wasn't flirting with anyone. Astrid defended, although her voice seemed shaky and afraid. Hiccup rolled his eyes and crossed his arms across his chest. Of course you did, I was there. His voice started to rise in volume ever so slightly. Just because they are my friends doesn't mean you can go and flaunt yourself at them as though you're a piece of meat. Hiccup didn't know what he was saying anymore, he was just spouting out the first words that were coming to mind. Some of them he regretted, others he had been wanting to say. What? Astrid replied, offended by his comment. I'm your husband. I'm supposed to be the one person that you care for in the world. The one person in your life whose compliments matter the most to you. But you feel more flattered about a random stranger's compliments than my own. Hiccup yelled in frustration, the true reason for his anger finally coming to the surface. Astrid was slightly thrilled by his jealous rage, and another part of her was angered by his behavior. Yes. I was flattered and I enjoyed their comments about me. But that doesn't mean I don't care about what you think. Astrid argued back, but it felt as though her comments were falling on deaf ears. It shouldn't matter what they say. It should matter what I say. But you don't say anything to me. I can't remember the last time you actually complimented my appearance to my face. Or tell me the things you like about me. Or just anything about me. Astrid countered, her words striking Hiccup like bullets in the wind. He felt the anger and sadness by her words, but they weren't enough to dispel his anger, so he continued to talk without much thought. You want me to compliment you? Fine. Hiccup stepped closer. I think you are the most attractive, beautiful, brave and sexy woman I have ever laid my eyes upon. He stepped closer, as Astrid took a step back closer to the wall. Every time you walk into the room it's as though an angel has descended from heaven and lit up the place with her presence. He took another step. Whenever I hear your voice, it's as though I'm being blessed by the voice of a goddess. Another step. And when you kiss me, it's as though I have died and gone to heaven. Her back hit the wall with a thud as Hiccup took his final step towards her, trapping her against the wall. Your kiss is the most magical thing I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing, and it's one of the many reasons that I love you, Astrid Haddock. His voice was smooth and polite as he spoke, his speech declining in anger. His words were only ever filled with love as he took those steps towards her, his eyes looking upon her figure as though she were truly an angel sent from heaven. With every word, Astrid felt his sincerity, it moved her heart more than she had ever experienced in her life. It was at that moment that she believed she had witnessed, and experienced, true love for the first time in her life. Do you mean it? Hiccup staggered back for a moment as he realized what he had said. Astrid smiled and held his figure in place so that he couldn't run away. Do you mean it? Do you love me? She asked again, now trapping him in his place. Yes. Hiccup lowered his head with a heavy sigh. I do love you, Astrid. With everything that I have. He admitted, ashamed at being caught. However, Astrid felt her heart skip a beat at his words, a warm feeling spreading across her chest as she heard his words fall from his mouth. She smiled wide and pulled him in, lifting his head in time to press her lips against his. Their kiss was only brief, but it said more than enough as she pulled away and met his gaze. I love you too, Hiccup Haddock. Chapter 47, Chapter 45. Chapter text. Astrid awoke the next morning in an unfamiliar room, however, there was something familiar about it that Astrid couldn't quite put her finger on. Her eyes fluttered open in the bright room, the sun shining through the half-opened curtains, and allowed Astrid a better look around the room. Flashes of last night sparked in her memory as she looked at the clothes strewn across the floor, the mess that had been caused in their wake as they had stumbled across the room and onto the bed. Oh, gods! Astrid sighed to herself as she scrunched her face and hid into the pillows, hiding her blushing cheeks from any prying eyes. I can't believe we did that. She muttered to herself, her face still buried in the pillow. However, despite any shame or embarrassment she may have been feeling, she couldn't wipe that insane, bright smile off of her face. Slowly rising out of bed, and finding one of Hiccup's nearby discarded shirts and pants, Astrid made her way out of the room with the memories of last night still floating around her head. She blushed as Hiccup's words from last night repeated in her head. His warm, soft tone made her feel like she was being hugged by a soft blanket. She had truly fallen in love with a wonderful man, and she wouldn't trade him for the world. So long as he extended her the same courtesy. Morning, Astrid. Hiccup called out to her as he watched her stumble sleepily into the kitchen, the events of last night just catching up to her. How are you feeling? He asked with a smirk, before turning back to the stove where he was cooking up some breakfast. Astrid waddled her way over to him, her feet unbalanced and her stride sloppy as she collapsed onto his back and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his back. So she muttered in reply, knowing that Hiccup wouldn't be expecting that type of explicit answer. And she was right. She giggled to herself as she noticed Hiccup's back tense and a small blush appeared on his cheeks from her short answer. Giving him a small poke in the side, she jolted him out of his trance and brought him back to reality as he smiled back down at her. Sorry. It's okay, you don't need to apologize for that. It's a common after effect. Astrid replied easily, snuggling her face more into Hiccup's back. A warm sensation filled Hiccup's body as he felt Astrid willingly touch him and be near him like this, making him feel loved for the first time in a long time. But I feel like I should. He smiled and gestured at the pan he was cooking on the stove. How about some extra bacon for, milady? He smirked, knowing the effect that nickname had on Astrid. She couldn't stop the blush from appearing on her cheeks as she nodded happily at his suggestion. If there is an offer for it, I would be a fool not to take it. She giggled, doing a slightly posh accent to her voice as she replied. Hiccup chuckled along with her and gestured to the kitchen island with a smile. All right, as you wish. Do you mind setting it up for me? It's nearly ready. Hiccup announced, giving the food another toss in the pan before getting out a couple of plates from the cupboards. Sure thing, Hunastrid replied, letting go of Hiccup's waist and grabbing some cutlery for the two of them and setting them up on the kitchen island. Hiccup had become momentarily stunned by Astrid's nickname for him, however, he quickly jolted himself out of it and continued to set up breakfast. Once everything was set up and the breakfast was set up in front of the two of them, they got stuck in. Astrid enjoyed the greasy, delicious taste of the bacon and the chewy rubber texture of the egg on her plate. Hiccup's breakfast had become her favorite delicacy because he made it so rarely, and she always enjoyed his meals. Hiccup watched Astrid eat with a pleasant smile, absent-mindedly eating his own whilst doing so. He enjoyed seeing the sparkle in her eye whenever she took a bite from his homemade meals, the smile whenever their eyes met at the table. He loved everything about her, even when she was eating. I love you. Hiccup whispered absent-mindedly, not fully realizing he had said it out loud. Astrid smiled, with a small blush on her cheeks and turned towards him. I love you too. She smiled brightly, luckily with an empty mouth, and Hiccup felt his heart race at her smile. She was magnificent, a real gem. And she loved him. I want you to be my secretary. Hiccup announced suddenly as Astrid was about to take a bite from her breakfast. However, his words stopped her in her tracks so that the food was left hanging on the fork. She slowly lowered the fork as she turned to face him with her eyebrows furrowed and a quizzical look taking over her features. You. What? Astrid was momentarily stunned by Hiccup's words, but his expression never changed. Hiccup tilted his head slightly, but his stoic emotion didn't falter from his face. I want you to be my secretary. He paused for a moment, confused about Astrid's surprise and silence. I don't know what is so confusing about that. No, Astrid started, turning to face him properly and taking his hands into her own. No, it's not that it's confusing. I'm just surprised. That's all. Astrid smiled nervously, not sure of her own emotions anymore as she took Hiccup's hands into her own. Why me, anyway? Don't you already have a secretary? She asked, remembering the irritatingly jealous secretary who sat in front of his office like a hormonal hawk. She hated that girl. Yes, I do. But she annoys the hell out of me. Always thinking that she has got a shot with me, even after I got married. Hiccup sighed, the frustration at hearing about Heather making his fists want to involuntarily clench. That's why I want you to replace her. Hiccup announced excitedly, turning to her with a bright smile. You want me to be annoying? No. No, no, no. That's not what I meant. I mean it in the way that I would rather have a secretary I am comfortable with, rather than that. Hiccup cut himself off before he gave Heather a rude name. Astrid chuckled at his silenced words, knowing what he wanted to say but didn't. She smiled, lowering her head and nodding sagely. I understand what you mean. She met his eyes again. But I thought we agreed that I would stay as Thorald's secretary. So that I could get more information and evidence against him. You know, be the man on the inside as it were. Astrid reminded him, but this only made Hiccup sigh heavily and lower his gaze to the floor and his grip upon Astrid's hands tightened. I know what I asked of you, and now I want to change it. Why? Because I don't want you to be in danger, Astrid. Hiccup's voice rose dramatically in volume, almost blasting Astrid's hair off of her shoulders. Hiccup took a deep breath in and relaxed his shoulders. If Thorald works out that you are working with me, and know all about his mixing with the board members, he may keep you away from me and continue to threaten me. He sighed again, pulling Astrid closer for a comforting hug. I don't know what I would do if you got hurt because of me. I just can't lose you. Especially not now. Astrid rubbed his back gently, his words sinking heavily in the air around them as the seconds ticked by. Astrid smiled and nodded in understanding, hugging him tighter as her decision was made in her mind. Okay. I accept. Hiccup smiled and pulled her closer. I will be your secretary. Chapter 48, Chapter 46. Chapter text. It had been a few weeks since their confession, and since Astrid had become Hiccup's secretary, and things between the young couple had been slow and sweet. Neither of them slept in the same room as the other, deciding that their relationship shouldn't change too much until they were sure they wanted to stay married. Granted, that was Astrid's idea. Hiccup already knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, but was willing to wait for her. Hiccup was waiting in the hall, adjusting his tie as he waited for Astrid to descend the stairs. It was time for work and Hiccup was waiting for Astrid to drive to work, both of them opting to carpool together like they used to. However, it was often Astrid who was the last one to descend the stairs, and the last one to be ready. Soon, Hiccup averted his eyes away from his tie and up towards the stairs where he saw Astrid descending with a smile on her face. Their eyes met from across the room and they stayed connected as she glided her way over to him. So, what do you think? She asked, gesturing to her black dress which hugged her curves, but frilled out at the bottom. It was long enough that it wasn't inappropriate, yet also short enough that it wasn't inconvenient. There was no special reason why she was wearing such a dress that day, apart from the fact that she had no other clothes to wear, as far as Hiccup was aware. Hiccup smiled at her dress, the way it hugged her figure, and he couldn't help but admire the woman in front of him. How am I so lucky to have a girl like you? Hiccup asked himself, the words stumbling from his lips as he stepped closer to her and slowly leaned down to peck her on the cheek. Astrid blushed lightly from his action and turned away. Let's go, we'll be late. Astrid shyly responded, ignoring Hiccup's question and choosing to walk past him and out of the door. Hiccup smiled to himself, loving the effect he had over Astrid, and hurried along behind her. As he closed the door behind him, he saw Astrid nearing the car and quickly ran to catch up to her. When he caught up to her, he grabbed her arm and pinned her against the car, her back flat against the car door and her eyes wide, staring into Hiccup's. Hiccup. What are you doing? She asked hesitantly, her voice cracking slightly from the fright at the sudden action. But Hiccup just smiled. I can afford to be late just once. Before she could register what was happening, Hiccup smashed his lips against hers, kissing her violently against the door of the car. His hand slid along her waist, pressing her further into the car whilst his mouth explored hers. Astrid lost herself in the heat and emotion of the kiss, wanting more from him with every push of his lips against her own. However, he pulled away too soon and smiled devilishly down at her. Astrid was left breathless and hot as she looked up at Hiccup, her cheeks blushing from the heat of her body. Hiccup pecked her lips with a small smirk and moved his way around the car to hop inside the driver's seat. As he moved away, Astrid placed her hand over her chest to soothe her rapidly beating heart. There was always some way that Hiccup could drive her crazy in a matter of seconds, and calm her down with just his touch. However, whenever he kissed her like that, it was the weirdest but most addictive feeling in the world. Quickly snapping herself from her trance, Astrid turned around and flung the door open and made her way into the car. Slamming the door behind her, Astrid let out a small sigh and relaxed into her seat, allowing the comfort of the seat to envelope her in its warmth. Hiccup chuckled at Astrid's relaxed expression as a sense of admiration and fondness swept over him as he watched his wife's face. What? Astrid asked, opening an eye towards Hiccup as she asked. Hiccup's smile only brightened as he met eyes with Astrid. Without a word, he leaned over towards her, their faces only an inch apart, and pulled down her seatbelt to secure her in her seat. Astrid felt her heart race at the closeness of their faces as Hiccup leaned over to grab the seatbelt, her mind immediately causing her to close her eyes as she thought he was going for an unexpected kiss. However, she was left disappointed as he pulled away without so much as a peck on the cheek. Nothing, Hiccup finally replied as he secured the belt in its fastener. Just thought you looked cute. He smiled and met her gaze, noticing the small blush he had caused to appear on her cheeks and felt a swell of pride build up within his chest. He made her blush. Let's get to work. We're going to be late. Astrid announced whilst trying to hide her blushing cheeks from Hiccup's eyes. But she was too late, he'd already seen them. Yes, milady. Hiccup replied with a curt nod and started the car, slowly pulling them out of the driveway. The drive was seemingly quiet, neither one of them speaking and enjoying the comfortable silence of the car around them. Occasionally Hiccup would sneak a peek towards Astrid, unable to stop the smile that would inevitably form on his face from her lost look. Without much thought, Hiccup fumbled around for Astrid's hand and held it in his own, cradling it in his grasp like a delicate piece of china. Astrid felt his attempts to grab her hand and watched as he took hold of her hand and settled them on the middle console of the car, comfortably resting there as Hiccup drove with one hand on the wheel. A small smile spread onto Hiccup's face as he felt Astrid squeeze his hand back as they drove down the roads towards their work, the small gesture warming Astrid's heart as they sat in the silence of the car. Soon, they pulled into the car park and stopped at their place, waiting a few moments to snap themselves out of their love-struck trance. Hiccup was the first to withdraw his hand and step out of the car into the car park. Astrid followed closely behind. As she came to stand beside Hiccup, she looked up at him with a loving gaze and a warm smile. Hiccup felt his heartbeat quicken as he looked upon her beautiful features just a few inches below him. "You ready?" he asked, eager to start the day with his secretary by his side. Smiling back, Astrid nodded and proceeded to follow Hiccup towards the elevators. However, as they entered through the doors towards the elevators, a mysterious hooded figure bumped straight into Hiccup. The man caught Hiccup by the hand and slipped a mysterious, small object into Hiccup's grip before sleuthing away into the shadows. Astrid tried to run after the figure but lost him in the darkness of the car park, whilst Hiccup observed the object in his hand. "I lost him," Astrid announced as she rejoined Hiccup at the elevators. She jogged up next to him and looked around for any more figures from out of the darkness. However, there were none. "Hiccup. You okay?" Hiccup's gaze was fixed upon the object in his hand, his fingers fiddling about with it in his palm, tossing and turning it around to uncover its contents. It was a USB stick or flash drive. Hiccup didn't know what information it contained, but he assumed it was sensitive due to how it was delivered to him. Astrid looked over to him with a curious gaze and looked upon the small object in his palm with a furrowed brow. "What is that?" she asked in confusion, trying to analyze the object as she stood beside Hiccup, his fingers still playing around with it in his palm. "It's a USB drive." Hiccup closed his fingers around the object and stuffed it into his pockets, concealing it from outside eyes. "Whatever is on it, must be secret and important," Hiccup concluded as he nodded towards the elevators with his head, gesturing to Astrid to move forward. "Let's go." With that, they entered the elevator. The silence seemed to consume them in the confines of the elevator, neither one daring to speak. Hiccup's attention was solely focused on the drive in his pocket, his hand grasping and feeling the object as he manipulated it around his grip. He wanted to know its secrets, desperate to uncover its untold mysteries, but the elevator was moving astronomically slowly. "Who do you think gave it to you?" Astrid asked, trying to break the silence between them. Both of them were eager to uncover the secrets of the drive. However, the mystery around its appearance was creepy enough to make the silence unbearable. Hiccup shrugged as he finally let go of the drive and straightened his suit jacket. "I don't know, but whoever gave it to us." The elevator doors pinged open. "Wanted to keep their identity secret." The couple walked down the corridors, Astrid walking a couple of paces behind Hiccup to show their professional status as boss and secretary. Hiccup hadn't particularly liked the idea of Astrid walking behind him. However, he had grown accustomed to the fact that it was an expected way of performance that he would just have to put up with. Yet, when they entered his office, Astrid strode proudly forward and gently placed her hands on the front of Hiccup's desk, leaning her weight onto her hands. She looked over to Hiccup, who slowly made his way over to his chair and quietly sat down within it whilst Astrid beamed excitedly at him. "Well?" Astrid asked eagerly, pressing him to insert the drive into the computer and uncover its secrets. "Come on," Astrid pleaded, her legs jumping in excited trepidation as Hiccup slowly reached into his pocket with a small smile. "Has anyone ever told you that you look cute when you're excited?" Hiccup asked as he placed the drive into the computer port and booted up his computer. Astrid rolled her eyes and gave him a straight-faced look. Her expression was less than impressed. "Yes. You." Repeatedly. She stoically replied, earning a small chuckle from Hiccup. "Right," he replied, swiftly returning his gaze to the computer screen in front of him. Soon, his fingers began clicking away at the keyboard, and his hands curiously moved the mouse around to navigate the screen. Yet, Once he clicked on a certain folder or document that escaped Astrid's vision, his eyes widened. What in the damn Helheim? Hiccup asked himself in shock as his eyes scanned the screen, his eyes paralyzed wide. Astrid snuck her way around the table to look at the screen with Hiccup, and as soon as her eyes landed on the LED lights of the screen, her mouth hung open. Upon the screen were hundreds of letters and images, all being used as blackmail. Many images were inappropriate and just downright nauseating to look at, the kind of images one would want to keep secret. The letters showed evidence of Thorald's fraudulent actions, showing how he had managed to bribe members of the board with money that never actually existed for them, and when they find that out they will already be imprisoned for their own fraudulent acts with that money. It was exactly the evidence that they had been looking for. Hiccup had been unable to prove how Thorald had been manipulating and bribing members of the board, but now the information was staring him right in the face. And he couldn't believe what he was reading. Thousands upon thousands of words explaining multiple assaults that had been covered up by his previous company, as well as the solutions behind many of the mysterious firings that had gone on in Stoich's company and Thorald's old company. That man is sick. Astrid spat out as she read the information on the screen, her face contorted into an expression of disgust. She could barely stomach half the words she had read, but she knew the sum of it. Her father was a mean son of a... Wait a minute, Astrid. Hiccup grabbed her arm, calming her growing rage and focusing her attention back on the screen. We can't show Thorald that we have this information, nor can we let him know that we know anything at all. We have to keep our heads down and figure out a way to send this information to the police. Hiccup explained, reasoning with her violent rage and causing her to yield to his commands. Rolling her eyes exasperatedly, Astrid leaned closer to him and whispered gently into his ear. So what do you suggest we do, wise guy? Astrid asked, a slight hint of anger and bitterness to her tone. Why can't we just send the police an email or go down to their station? She asked in confusion, thinking that they were on the home straight. Whereas Hiccup knew there was one secret, hidden obstacle to master. If we do that, Thorald will know something's up and he might even try and skip town. We just can't take the risk that he might have hacked into the computer systems and can see all outgoing mail to outside companies or addresses. I can't risk it. Not when we're so close. Hiccup explained, adding a heavy sigh to the end of his words to punctuate the impact of their next moves. So, what are we going to do about it? Astrid asked, a small smile on her face as she could already see the cogs whirring inside Hiccup's brain. Probably something stupid. Hiccup shrugged. Right, she pointed at the screen and her wedding ring. But you've already done that. She chuckled and Hiccup smiled brightly at her before the smile fell from his face and the look of inspiration raced across it. Then something crazy. Chapter 49, Chapter 47. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. What in Thor's name? Astrid asked herself as she looked around the familiar room, an unwelcome sense of dread filling her body as her eyes landed upon two approaching figures. Why am I here again? She muttered to herself as the faces became clearer, and her father emerged from the crowd with Alvin following closely behind. Astrid. There you are, my beautiful daughter. Thorald wrapped his arm around Astrid's shoulder, being a bit too familiar with his daughter than he normally was. His heavy arm bruised Astrid's shoulders as she hesitantly looked over to the large man with her father. This is your daughter? Alvin asked, raising a gentle eyebrow at Thorald before turning back to Astrid with a fiendish gaze. Thorald squeezed Astrid's shoulders and pulled her closer to him. Why, yes. Of course. Thorald announced, as though he was showing off his prize horse. She's pretty one, isn't she? The only one I've got. He laughed haughtily, a devilish smile covering his features as he looked over to Alvin, who shared his expression. Astrid wanted to shrink and run away, in fact, that was what she was desperately trying to do. However, her father's grip and weight upon her shoulders were trapping her in place. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for any signs of Hiccup anywhere, but she couldn't find any. Who are you looking for, my dear? Astrid inwardly cringed at the name her father had just given her. However, she smiled shyly up towards her father and spoke gently in reply. I'm looking for Hiccup, my husband, Astrid announced, continuing her search for Hiccup around the room. Yet, Thorild's laughter cut her search short as she turned towards her father with a confused look across her face. Her father's laughter was loud and obnoxious, and Astrid could tell it was slightly derisive. "What?" she asked, confused by his reaction to her seemingly normal actions. "You don't have a husband, Astrid. And who is this Hiccup? What kind of a name is that?" Thorild laughed again, Alvin beginning to laugh along with him. But Astrid's expression fell and her heart dropped dramatically. "What do you mean? You married me off to him. He's Stoic Haddock's son." Astrid defended, her fists balled up in fear as she began predicting Thorild's next answer. She just didn't want it to be true. Stoic Haddock's son. "Astrid, Stoic never had a son," Thorild replied. Astrid felt her heart stop and her lungs collapse. No air could be let into her body as she felt dizzy and extremely nauseous. The room began spinning and her head felt heavy. She wanted to run away, but her father's arm was keeping her locked in place. "I need some air," Astrid announced, but as she tried to walk away, her father pulled her back towards Alvin. "Perhaps Alvin here could take you outside. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to spend some more time with you." Thorild's voice diminished slightly as Astrid was taken across the room towards the deck outside by Alvin's forceful grip. Outside, there were no people and no way to look back inside the grand hall behind them. They were all alone. Once the doors shut to the inside, Astrid was thrust against the wall by Alvin, and his intimidating stare was locked onto Astrid's, and it was clear what he was intending to do. "You know, your father was right." Astrid furrowed a brow whilst pushing her hands against his chest to get him away from her. "You are a fighter." He smiled devilishly and lunged towards her neck, intending to kiss her there. "I like that." "No!" Astrid yelled, sitting up violently in her bed. Sweat was pouring from her forehead and her heart was racing in her chest. She put her hand to her head in exasperation as she recalled what she had just seen. Was it just a dream? As many times as she asked herself that question, she could never answer it for herself. She wanted to see Hiccup. She needed to see him. Crawling out of her bed, a pillow in hand and clutched to her chest, Astrid made her way out into the corridor outside Hiccup's room. Stood before the door, and she hesitated. Her hand hovered in the air before the handle of Hiccup's door, expecting him to be asleep, and there was no need to knock. With a deep breath, Astrid pushed the door open and stumbled sleepily into Hiccup's dark room. Due to the darkness surrounding her, she could barely find her way to his bed, but soon collided with it and crept onto the soft mattress towards Hiccup. Once she was sat beside him, she gave his shoulder a small nudge, but when that didn't rouse him from sleep, she tried an even harder nudge. "Hiccup! Hiccup!" Astrid whispered loudly, trying to wake him up from his apparent deep sleep. Soon, Hiccup groaned loudly to indicate his awareness, and he turned around in bed towards her, rubbing his eyes cutely as he looked at her. A look of confusion passed over his features as he met Astrid's gaze, her presence in his room being an unknown phenomenon he had never experienced before. With that thought on his mind, he wished he had worn a shirt. Pulling the sheets up to his neck, trying to cover up his naked torso with the sheets despite her encounters with his bare chest before, Hiccup spoke up. "Astrid." He started, whispering to her gently. "What are you doing here?" he asked in concern, noticing her tired, fearful eyes and a teary expression. In an instant, Astrid leapt towards him and enveloped Hiccup in an enormous bear hug. Her arms wrapped around his neck in a flash and gripped him tighter than a snake as he gently pulled up an arm to cradle her back and hug her. "What's wrong?" Hiccup asked again, curious as to her current actions. She had never once willingly entered his room and climbed into his bed without a reason, even if that reason seemed unprecedented and unfound. Astrid slowly raised her head and met his eyes, suddenly feeling embarrassed about her appearance before him. Having to admit that she had had a nightmare was embarrassing and shameful to her, she was an adult after all. But as she gazed into Hiccup's eyes, all her fears of judgment melted away with his comforting gaze. "I had a nightmare," Astrid stuttered out, her pride trying to withhold the information from her husband. However, her heart pushed the words out from her closed mouth and poured them out before Hiccup, open for judgment. Instead of laughing or ridiculing the childish nature of her reasoning, Hiccup's gaze softened and he hugged her tighter. His grip upon her body grew stronger and he threw both of his arms around her, one hand gently stroking the back of her head calmly. "It's okay, you're here now. You're safe. I've got you." Hiccup soothed, calming Astrid's rapidly beating heart with his gentle touches and smooth words. "You want to tell me about it?" he asked gently, offering the chance to cathartically rid herself of the nightmare. However, Astrid shook her head and nestled her head into Hiccup's chest, pulling him down onto the bed and pulling the covers up over their bodies. Hiccup smiled at her cute behavior, her resistance to admit her fears bothering her slightly as she hid her face in his chest. But he wasn't about to pry it out of her. It was her choice to remain silent on the matter. "How about you tell me a story?" Astrid asked, beginning to draw small circles on Hiccup's chest as she moved her head to rest on his shoulder, his arm stretched out as her pillow behind her head. Hiccup smiled down at her blushing cheeks and her focused gaze upon his chest. "Okay, what kind of story? Real or imaginary?" he asked curiously, looking down at her as though she were a child asking her father for a bedtime story. Astrid gave him a small slap on the chest with a cute little chuckle and scowled at him with her furrowed brow. "Real, obviously," she countered, an imperceptible roll of her eyes accentuating her words. Hiccup nodded in agreement and let out a heavy sigh as he began to think of a good story to tell. It had to be funny, it had to be real, and it had to be good. But nothing that exciting had ever happened to Hiccup, not before he met Astrid. His life had been pretty lonely and isolated because of his father's company, so what kind of story would be exciting in such a mundane life? However, Hiccup was sure he could think of something. "Okay, well," Hiccup began without much confidence. "You remember a while ago I told you I wanted to be an artist when I grew up?" Astrid nodded in reply, her hands still resting on his chest. "Well, before I started working at the company, I was managing to sell some of my works to antique shops and those little stores with all the art pieces. It was going steady, there wasn't a huge amount of income coming in because I wasn't a big name yet, but it was good money. However, I never told my father about it, so I always had to keep everything on the DL, if you get what I mean. Anyway, once I got a massive gig at the local art gallery, I believe it's closed down now, and they offered me about 10,000 to put up my works in their gallery. I was surprised when they contacted me because I didn't think I was a big enough name yet." Hiccup shrugged, a small smile making its way onto his face. "That offer was everything to me. It felt as though everything in my life was finally coming together and this gig was going to be my once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and I would be a fool to pass it down. However, you can guess what happened next." Hiccup sighed, lowering his gaze and gently shaking his head in defeat, as though he was reliving the pain of that day once more. "What happened?" Astrid yawned, the tiredness evident in her voice as she started to doze off on his chest. But she was desperate to hear more of his story. "Well, my father caught wind of what I was doing and he shut the whole thing down." "Wait." Astrid piped up, slightly raising her head off of Hiccup's chest. "He shut down the art gallery?" Hiccup nodded. "Yeah, and I lost my big prize of 10 grand and an opportunity of a lifetime all because my dad wanted me to become the next heir to the company. I never wanted anything to do with that company. I felt even worse about it after my dad managed to convince them to shut down the art gallery. My father believed that shutting it down was the only way to stop me from pursuing my dream, although he called it a hobby." Hiccup shrugged, and let out a sad sigh. "He never once believed that I had a dream and wanted to pursue the one thing that made me happy. He just didn't understand that I could be different from him. The company was his dream, it was never mine." Hiccup sighed again and turned his gaze over to Astrid who had fallen asleep on his chest peacefully. Hiccup couldn't help but smile at the sight before him, her perfectly parted lips as she drifted deeper into her slumber. In Hiccup's eyes, she looked beautiful. Like a goddess. Tucking a stray piece of hair out of her eyes, Hiccup stroked her face and smiled sweetly at her sleeping expression, her brows furrowing slightly from his warm touch. "Good night, milady," he whispered and placed a gentle peck upon her head before laying himself down to sleep. Notes. Coming into the home stretch, only a few more chapters to go. Chapter 50, Chapter 48. Chapter text. Stoic's office had been quiet, unusually quiet. For some reason or another, there hadn't been much paperwork or board members meeting with him to discuss important information and future deals. It had been quiet. Normally, this would have been a relaxing day for Stoic. Without much important work to be done, he could just as easily relax into his chair and drift away. However, after what Hiccup had warned him about and Spitaloot's recent betrayal, this unusual quietness unnerved him. He didn't like it one bit. Nevertheless, a sudden, loud knock sounded from the door, the heavy thuds echoing around his room like drumbeats. Stoic straightened himself up in his chair, straightening his tie and raising his expression into a smile. He looked over to the door and prepared himself for what was to come. "Come in," Stoic called, allowing his guest entry into his large office. His desk sat right at the far end of his office and his desk faced the door at the other end. In the middle of the room were a set of chairs and a table, which could be used for small meetings with board members to discuss any important or emergent information. However, it hadn't been used as of late and was therefore gathered a thin layer of dust over its leather skin. The door to his office gently opened, and by the movement of the handle and door movement, Stoic knew it wasn't his son. His curiosity was piqued when he saw Astrid's face appear from behind the door, her expression wary and unnerved as she entered his office. Closing the door behind her, Astrid made her way further into Stoic's office and carefully approached his desk, her head slightly lowered as she stood before him. "Astrid," he announced happily, throwing his arms in the air in celebration of her arrival. His face was beaming with joy at Astrid's presence in his office on this rather dull and quiet day. Astrid smiled back hesitantly and slowly raised her eyes to face him. "What can I do for you, my love?" he asked with a smile, his voice welcoming and friendly. "Well," Astrid started reluctantly, finally having a moment of fear and regret for her actions as she fiddled with the object in her hand. "There's something I need to tell you and something you need to see." She spoke quietly, the feeling of fear and regretfully beginning to seep into her skin as she looked about the room in an attempt to avoid Stoic's gaze. "What is it?" "It's okay," Stoic offered a warm, comforting smile her way. When their eyes met, Astrid felt a large weight of her fear slip away as Stoic smiled at her in his own way. "You can tell me anything." His voice was gentle and soft, and he held out a hand towards Astrid that led her down a safe path. "Okay." Astrid breathed, exhaling heavily as she placed the object on Stoic's desk with a soft thud. Her hand let the object fall onto the desk, and when her hand retreated away from the desk, it revealed a small USB drive that Hiccup had been given. "A flash drive?" Stoic asked as he picked up the item and carefully twirled it around in his fingers, looking at each side with care as it moved between his fingers. Astrid nodded and took another deep sigh before she spoke again. "Yes, and on that drive is all the information you need to solve this problem with the board," Astrid announced, earning a confused look from Stoic as he placed the drive back down on the desk. "The problem with the board?" Stoic asked, raising his eyebrows slightly at Astrid's words. "What problem is this, exactly?" he asked, a small chuckle knitted into his voice as he spoke. "My father." Stoic's face fell, and he looked at Astrid with a very serious look. It was clear he did not enjoy those words. "You better be very careful with what you are saying here, my dear. He is my best friend and your father, we have known each other for years. That man would never betray me." Stoic argued, dead set in his ways that it was clear he wouldn't see the reality of his life. Astrid sighed and plugged the drive into his computer before Stoic could argue or protest her actions. "Then have a look for yourself." Multiple windows from the drive began to flash onto Stoic's screen, each detailing the numerous acts that Thorold had committed in order to remove Stoic from the board. "What in Odin's name?" "On this drive is everything that Thorold has done during his time at this company, even the things he would rather you didn't know about. He has committed numerous types of fraud, he has blackmailed almost all of the board members to vote against you, and he has bribed many members of the company and partner companies to go against you." Astrid explained as Stoic's eyes scanned the screen before him, his fists slowly turning white from the rage and strength of his hands. "That bastard!" he yelled, slamming his fists onto the desk in anger, almost splintering the wood beneath his skin. "I'm going to kill him," Stoic announced, beginning to make his way around the desk in anger, but Astrid leapt ahead of him before he could go any further. "No. Don't!" Astrid shouted, holding her hands up in front of her to stop Stoic in his tracks. He obeyed but wore an expression of impatience and rage. "What? He betrayed me, Astrid. He deserves to be punished." He yelled in her face, his spit flying everywhere as he spoke. Astrid wiped off a bit that had landed on her face and sighed, slowly lowering her hands. He threatened Hiccup. Astrid spoke quietly, but this only fueled Stoic's rage. If we confront him now, he could find a way to enact his punishment on Hiccup. I don't want that. We need to be patient, and we have to be logical. Astrid explained, a small and in her heart as she spoke about Hiccup's blackmail of his father. I don't want to take any risks. Stoic looked at Astrid with a sympathetic look. He could see the fear and hurt in her eyes as she thought about the threat against her husband's life, and it filled Stoic's heart with a sense of warmth. When the two had first married, he knew they were only doing it because they were asked, but to know that they were now in love, filled Stoic with a new sense of love and happiness for the pair. Okay. Stoic replied, loosening his fists and lowering his head apologetically. He nodded in understanding of her request and took a large, deep breath to calm himself down. Astrid smiled at his actions and felt thankful for his understanding. But what do you suggest we do? He asked, his mind blank with no plan for how to proceed. Well, I suggest we take this evidence to the police station. Maybe if they can get an arrest warrant on him, then perhaps he won't have the chance to enact his threat on Hiccup. Astrid explained, suggesting the pal with a hesitant mind. But Stoic's expression told her that he agreed with her words. I agree, I think that would be the best course of action. Stoic nodded in agreement before a beaming smile appeared on his face and he brought Astrid into a strong, bone-crushing hug. Oh. I knew you'd be a brilliant addition to our family, Astrid. I always knew that Hiccup was meant to be a businessman. Stoic was thrilled, overjoyed with the news of their relationship still going strong. However, as the words left his mouth, Astrid managed to push Stoic off of her and gave him a grave look of disappointment. Her scowl sent an unknown shiver through Stoic's body and he felt, for the first time, as though he had said something wrong. What is it? Have I said something wrong? He asked curiously, at a loss for his mistake. Yes. You have said something wrong. Astrid snapped, a small growl following her words as she brushed a frustrated hand through her hair delicately. Hiccup has never wanted to be a businessman, nor was he ever meant to be one. Stoic looked taken aback by her words, but he didn't speak a word. You've been so obsessed with keeping your company together to pass on your son that you didn't even take into account anything that he wanted to do. He told me about that art gallery, the one that you closed down when they offered to put up his artwork. It was the greatest opportunity of a lifetime for him, a chance to finally chase his dream, and you killed it. Astrid explained, her face turning red from the frustration of Stoic's ignorance. It was a useless dream. He wasn't going to make it anywhere in the world, he was only going to become a low-life artist and come running back to me with his tail between his legs. I was just trying to keep him where he wouldn't get hurt. Stoic argued, sure that his decision was correct. By crushing his soul and happiness. By instilling a deep-seated fear and hatred towards his father. Did you want to protect him from getting hurt by hurting him in the process? Do you hear yourself? Astrid asked, bewildered at the confidence of Stoic's words. This man truly believed that trapping his son in a job he never wanted was the best thing for him. Of course, I hear myself, and I was right in doing that. He married you after all. He announced, proud about that small fact of coincidence. Astrid couldn't help but scoff and roll her eyes. I married him because my father blackmailed me. He married me because he feared you so much that he couldn't say no. Astrid answered him, starting to crack the illusion that Stoic had built himself. But you love him now. Of course I do, but that is because of who he is, not his position or money. I love the guy who cares about the people around him more than himself, the guy who hides his true talents because he has been taught to believe that they are worthless. I am in love with the artist with no prospects or family, because he is a lot better person than the coup of some big shot company like this. Astrid yelled, her frustration beginning to get the better of her. Would you still love him the same if he wasn't in this company? Would you really? Stoic countered, challenging her love as though he had a foot to stand on in this fight. I doubt I would have even had the chance to meet him. I only met him because of this company, but I know that I would have been a fan of him or at least have bought his artwork. Astrid argued back, catching Stoic off guard with her reality check. So, yes. I bet I would have loved him all the same, maybe even more. I guess I did the right thing then. Putting him in this company. Otherwise, you would have never met him. Stoic folded his arms across his chest, as though he had already won. So, was I supposed to fall in love with the man that he pretends to be in front of you, or the man that he is when he is with me? Frankly, I prefer that hiccup. The one who loves and respects his mother so much that he wants to be happy like he had promised her, and the only way he has been able to do that is by loving me. Honestly, I'm okay with him loving me more than I love him because when he is happy I am happy too. For me, that's all that matters. I just hoped he had a parent that felt the same way. Astrid announced before turning on her heel in frustration and storming out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Once she left the room, Astrid whimpered in fear and regret and collapsed her face into her hands, shaking her head sorrowfully as her words finally sank in. Her body shivered in fear at what Stoic might think of her now, worried that he might threaten or hurt Hiccup in any way because of her. She hated herself for getting so carried away and slunk her way down the corridor and away from Stoic's office. What in Helheim did I just do? Astrid questioned herself as she took one last regretful look at Stoic's office. I just hope he still listens to me about that flash drive. Astrid muttered to herself before she disappeared out of the corridor and made her way back to Hiccup's office. Chapter 51, Chapter 49. Notes. Sorry, accidentally published the same chapter twice. Laughing smiley. Chapter text. The next few weeks passed by quietly, and Astrid was thankful that Stoic had heeded her advice and taken the information to the police, all the while keeping everything quiet. She appreciated his subtlety as he dealt with the problems of the board, slowly regaining the reputation and support he had before. In fact, he was mainly pushing for Hiccup to take his place sooner even without an heir. Heather, meanwhile, as Thorild's new secretary, was sat behind her desk feeling rather bored. She had her head resting on her palm as she stared down the corridor ahead of her. Recently, the board members hadn't been too social with Thorild and she had no meetings to schedule either. For Thorild, everything was getting too quiet. Perhaps I could create a scandal around Hiccup, maybe, he's cheating on his wife. Heather whispered to herself, planning a new way to ruin Hiccup and Astrid's relationship and reputation. No, that's too risky. Besides, there's no chance it'll work after my last attempt. The image of Kristoff and Astrid popped into her mind. No, it has to be something about Astrid. I can't risk Hiccup losing everything if I want him to be with me. Heather continued to theorize to herself, lost in her thoughts mindlessly. Grabbing a notepad from one of her desk drawers, Heather started jotting down random thoughts, many of which were viciously aimed at Astrid. Her thoughts on Hiccup were that of a teenage girl doting over a crush who didn't even know she existed. Maybe I could cause a major accident to her, not enough to kill her, but enough to. No, that might just bring them closer. She scribbled out the idea and scratched away at the words. What else? She asked herself, tapping the pen against her chin. Perhaps I could cause major controversy, perhaps she's pregnant with someone else's child. No, that wouldn't work. Suddenly, a loud, thunderous noise sounded from the direction of the elevators, and it was enough to snap Heather out of her vicious thought cycle and look up from her desk. Looking down the corridor she could just about spot the approaching shadows, their large figure growing in size as they approached. However, when their owners appeared in the corridor, Heather felt her heart stop and she rose to her feet without much thought. What's going on? She asked as a large group of men, headed by Stoic, charged towards Thorild's office. However, her question went unanswered as they stopped in front of Thorild's office and organized themselves together. Heather could only look on as she spotted a group of policemen accompanying Stoic, as well as Hiccup and Astrid lingering at the back of the group. All right men, whatever happens, make sure that man stays under control. He's a wild card and won't hesitate to bargain his way out of this. One of the police officers announced, looking over at his subordinates as he issued his orders. They all nodded in understanding in unison and turned towards the door, poised at the ready. 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 Upon their response, the door was heavily kicked in by the leading officer and was quickly followed by the others. All the officers, of which there were around 5, charged into Thorild's office and swiftly apprehended the man, much to his dismay and resistance. What in Thor's name do you think you are doing? Unharmed me. Thorold protested as the policeman jostled him out of the office, Thorold struggling recklessly in their grip. Once they had passed the threshold out of his office, Thorold locked eyes with Stoic, who had been patiently waiting outside Thorold's office. Stoic wore a face of thunder and looked as though he wanted Thorold dead yesterday. His arms were folded across his chest and his jaw was locked tight. It was clear that this man was in no mood to sympathize with anyone. Stoic. But Thorold thought he could try. Please, Stoic. You've got to help me. I don't know why they are arresting me, but whatever it is, I'm sure I'm innocent. Thorold protested, his voice seemingly of an innocent and desperate man. But Stoic didn't believe him for a second. Now that he knew the truth, he realized how blinded by Thorold's words he had become. He didn't realize the man had such a way with language that it made you pity him and believe every word leaving his mouth. Oh, shut up you imprudent little troll. Stoic spat, his voice stinging Thorold's skin as Stoic foul-mouthed him for the first time in their friendship. Thorold wore a convincingly shocked and hurt expression, but Stoic was beyond sympathy for the man. Stoic. You're being arrested now because you should have been arrested a long time ago. Did you really think you could get away with it all? Thorold's face slowly fell, the expression on his face dissolving away in a matter of seconds with each word. Did you think I wouldn't find out about the blackmail, and the fraud and the murder? You thought you could hide it all under mountains of paperwork and bodyguard units that I hired for you. You think I wouldn't find out? Stoic prompted, his confidence getting the better of him as he saw his ex-best friend standing before him finally having his bad actions catch up to him. But Thorold stood tall. As a matter of fact, I did. I really didn't think you were smart enough to uncover all of my secrets. Thorold held his head high, his words showing no remorse for his actions. Hiccup wanted to punch the guy in the face, but Astrid's calm hand wrapped in his own soothed his temper. How did you figure it out? All of my misconducts. Who told you? His voice was stern and demanding, and Stoic found himself trapped under its thrall. It wasn't me who figured it out, my son did. The soon-to-be chairman of this company. Stoic announced, his words sending a small shiver of fear and shock through Thorold's system. The one flaw in his plan finally came through. Hiccup was going to replace Stoic. How could he remove him? Does that mean? Thorold asked, barely able to muster up the words to finish his question. He didn't want to believe that he had been wrong about his daughter, that the long years of hardship he had put her through had been for nothing. She couldn't be pregnant. No, but Hiccup doesn't need an heir to take over the company. He has already proved his worth by ridding me of a vile leech such as yourself. Stoic spat, his words ricocheting off every wall as the two stared each other down. I don't want, nor do I need, an ugly creature such as yourself hanging around my company, and threatening my workers, even worse my son. You never deserved this company, and it was never meant to be yours. Stoic yelled, finally snapping his thread of reason in front of this small group of police officers, who lost focus from their task by the frightening aura that Stoic was giving off. This little blink of fear was just enough of a window that Thorold was able to violently break himself free from the policeman's grasp. Dashing out of the arms, and throwing two of them to the floor, he dashed over to Astrid before anyone in the room could figure out what was going on. Snatching her out of Hiccup's grasp, Thorold wrapped his arm around Astrid's throat and pulled out a concealed knife from within his jacket, pressing it gently onto her neck, breaking the skin ever so slightly. Astrid! Hiccup called out in panic but froze in place. Nobody move! Thorold yelled, causing everybody in the room to freeze in place, the prospect of an innocent's life being in danger. But for Hiccup, it felt as though the floor was giving way and he was about to plunge 1,000,000 feet to the ground. His stomach wrenched and his heart dropped into his stomach. He had never felt fear like it before, the idea of Astrid being in danger scared him more than his worst fear ever could. And the thought of how scared she was in the hands of her murderous father pained him even more. Nobody move or I'll cut this woman right where she stands. Thorold threatened, darting the knife between Astrid's neck and pointing it at the surrounding officers. He took a moment to look at the faces of every individual looking at him, and the attention that he had managed to capture. They were all under his thrall, and all because he had leverage in this fight. However, when his eyes fell upon Hiccup's face, Thorold couldn't help but smile. The man looked pathetic. I told you, Hiccup. Thorold began, pointing the knife at Hiccup as he spoke. If you betrayed me, I would hurt the one thing you can't live without. He pressed the knife back onto Astrid's neck, allowing a small droplet of blood to trickle down the blade as it rested against the skin. Hiccup's fists turned white from the strength of his fury. His fingernails were beginning to cut into his skin and his teeth were beginning to grind down from his clenched jaw. The anger and fear flowing through Hiccup's body was a stronger feeling than anything Hiccup had ever felt before, and he could barely control himself. Let her go, Thorold. She's not a part of this. Hiccup tried to bargain, desperate to get Astrid out of Thorold's grasp and save her life. Maybe. But she got involved as soon as she married you. That's because you threatened me to marry him, otherwise you'd cut me off. Astrid countered, her words muttered through gritted teeth as she held onto his arm that was wrapped around her throat. Shut it. Thorold seethed, glancing down at Astrid for a split second to scold his daughter. Whilst Thorold was distracted scolding his daughter, Hiccup took the opportunity to wiggle himself further forward. Now, he was standing even closer to Thorold than before, and a glimmer of hope shone in his chest as he was closer to Astrid as well. When Thorold looked back up to see Hiccup standing closer to him than before, he took a few steps backwards, pulling Astrid along with him. Thorold quickly pointed the knife towards Hiccup in a threatening manner, but it only looked like a last effort to ward off any dangers. But it was already too late. As Thorold pointed towards Hiccup with his knife, Hiccup took the opportunity, no matter how dangerous, to lunge towards Thorold. He quickly grabbed a hold of Thorold's hand holding the knife and swiftly disarmed the man, but his grip upon Astrid only tightened. Although Hiccup had managed to subdue the threat of the knife, he hadn't managed to free Astrid from his clutches. Hiccup. Astrid wheezed as Thorold crushed his arm against Astrid's throat, beginning to crush her windpipe. Hiccup felt a surge of fear and panic rush through him as he saw his wife in danger. Before anyone could intervene, Hiccup twisted Thorold's arm around and grabbed Astrid from under his grip and punched Thorold in the stomach, causing him to release his grip upon Astrid. Astrid fell into Hiccup's arms as Hiccup turned to Thorold and kicked him in the genital area, with a rather forceful kick. That's for hurting my wife, Hiccup announced after he landed the hurtful blow to Thorold's crotch, causing the man to curl up and shield the area. Astrid smiled at Hiccup's actions and hobbled her way over to her father. With an exciting shove, she kicked her father full in the face with her heel, almost piercing through his cheek. And that. She landed the blow to his face, is for everything else. She announced as she stood back on her feet and clutched onto Hiccup's side, holding his shirt tightly in her hands as his arms were wrapped protectively around her waist. Hiccup smiled to himself as they all watched Thorold be dragged out of the office, his legs trailing behind him as the officer hauled him down the corridor and away from their sight. Hiccup and Astrid stood in front of Thorold's office, regaining their composure and breath from the recent events. Stoic stood with them, also trying to compose himself after what had just occurred, and he faced the Haddock couple with a worried smile. Is everything okay? Are you all right, Astrid? Stoic asked, like a worried father. Astrid smiled up at him, whilst rubbing the area around her neck to soothe the aching feeling. Yeah, I think I'll be all right. She responded with a nod and turned her gaze over to Hiccup. I have him to protect me after all. Hiccup blushed madly at her words, and the reaction caused a small chuckle to erupt from both Stoic and Astrid. Stoic felt warmed by the effect that Astrid had over Hiccup, and he was reminded of his love for Valka when he looked at the young couple. You're right. Hiccup may not look like it, but... Stoic rested a hand on Hiccup's shoulder, causing his son to meet his eye. He's the best of us all. He smiled lovingly down at his son. For the first time in years, Hiccup finally felt the feeling of being loved, of having a father be proud to call a Hiccup his son. Chapter 52, Chapter 50. Notes. Final chapter. Bonus epilogue coming tomorrow. Chapter text. Are you sure you're okay? Astrid asked Hiccup worriedly, her hands moving about his body checking for injuries. The couple were now in the car together, ready to head home early after a long and arduous day at work. Ever since the incident, Astrid hasn't been able to stop fretting over Hiccup and checking whether he was okay. Hiccup, meanwhile, reveled in the attention of Astrid, her kindness and affection making him feel important and loved. Astrid, I said I'm fine. You should be more worried about yourself. Hiccup pushed her hands away, his palm showed towards her and flashed a line of red blood on his skin. Astrid immediately snatched the hand and looked at the cut on the skin, a thin, clean cut rested upon the skin. Hiccup. She scolded. You are not fine. What is this? She asked in concern, the sight of blood on his skin making her heart race in panic. But Hiccup pulled his hand away from her grip. It's okay, Astrid. I'll be fine. It's just a scratch. Hiccup shrugged it off, covering up the wound with his other hand. But Hiccup, at least put a plaster over it. Please, I so rarely get to look after you. Astrid admitted, blushing at the words falling out of her mouth. I enjoy babying you like this. After all, you did just save my life. She looked up into his eyes and saw a shimmering brightness within them that she had never seen before. Gods, I love you. He whispered before pulling Astrid into a big, passionate kiss. The kiss started as a loving peck, but as they pulled away and met each other's eyes, their lips locked again as their tongues collided together in a magical waltz. Hiccup. Astrid breathed between the kiss, trying to pull herself away. However, her breathy voice and the call of his name only pushed Hiccup on further. Astrid. He breathed back, wrapping a hand behind her neck to pull her in closer. Hiccup. Astrid finally caught her breath and pushed Hiccup away, the two of them panting loudly as the car steamed up from their ragged breaths. Hiccup gazed into her eyes as though she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and his desire to kiss her again was driving him wild. But he held himself back, for her. What's wrong? He asked, his hand still wrapped behind her neck, his fingers caressing her skin there as he waited for her response. Restrain yourself, anyone would think that you're a horny teenager. Astrid chuckled as her blushing cheeks showed how affected by his actions she was. Hiccup smiled and pulled his hands away from her, returning them to the steering wheel ready to move the car. Only with you, milady. Anyone who has kissed your lips would never want to stop either. Hiccup admitted as he started the car and pulled them out of the car park, while Astrid sat silently blushing in the passenger seat. How could he say such a thing and not be bothered? The journey continued in silence, neither one of them willing to talk. Astrid couldn't calm herself after Hiccup's teasing quip, and it caused her mind to race with ideas that made her blush even harder. Hiccup's grip on the wheel often tightened as he thought about Astrid being in Thorald's arms just a few hours ago. I never asked, but... Hiccup started, not looking at Astrid's way but seeing her gaze flick towards him upon the sound of his words. When he grabbed you. He paused again, his grip upon the wheel increasing again. Were you scared? Astrid gulped nervously at his question, surprised by the sudden curiosity of her husband. She looked away for a while before sighing heavily, resigning herself to an answer. Yes, I was. I mean, I did have a knife to my throat after all. She chuckled and saw Hiccup's face harden. Reaching out, Astrid took Hiccup's hand into her own and linked her fingers into his grasp. But I wasn't as terrified as I thought I would be. Because I knew that you were there to save me. She smiled and looked up to see his smiling, blushing face trying to keep his eyes on the road. Okay, stop. He smiled, chuckling softly as he squeezed Astrid's hand back gently. Otherwise you're gonna make me crash this car because I want to kiss you so much right now. Astrid laughed along with him and turned back to look ahead of her and at the road ahead. Then stop asking questions you already know the answer to. She smiled smugly and relaxed into her seat, their hands still interlocked and resting in the middle console together. However, their awkward journey soon came to an end, much to their relief, as Hiccup pulled into the driveway of their home and turned off the engine of the car. Astrid was the first to retrieve her hand out of Hiccup's and exit the car, leaving Hiccup looking at where her hand had previously laid. Hiccup soon followed Astrid out of the car and rushed over to join her at the door, unlocking it for both of them to enter. Astrid pushed the door open after Hiccup unlocked it and hurried herself inside, a heavy exhale bursting out of her mouth. Phew! She exclaimed, finding her way into the living room and collapsing herself down onto the sofa. I'm glad that's all over and we can finally relax. She commented as she got herself comfortable on the sofa. Hiccup, meanwhile, had followed Astrid to the living room and was now standing in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest, and his body leaning against the door frame. He smiled at Astrid's exhausted figure and couldn't help but find her actions cute and funny. I wanna take you out to dinner. Hiccup announced suddenly, his request taking Astrid by surprise as she bolted up in her seat and gave him a quizzical look. What? Hiccup joined Astrid in the living room and sat beside her on the sofa, resting a lonely hand on her thigh comfortably. It's been about a month since we decided to make this whole thing between us real, and since then we haven't gone on a single date. Hiccup pointed out, a tone of disappointment to his voice. Really, Hiccup? Astrid sat up properly and faced her husband. We're already married. Why would we need to go out on a date? She asked as though the question was obvious. But Hiccup looked unconvinced. That's not the point, Astrid. He sighed, but I still want to take you out, and besides. Hiccup looked down at his hands nervously. There's something I want to give you. He announced sheepishly, with which Astrid perked up upon hearing. Really? She asked curiously, intrigued by this mysterious gift Hiccup had prepared for her. What is this gift? Astrid asked, leaning forward towards Hiccup with a bright, flirtatious smile. When Hiccup was flashed with that expression, his resolve faltered for a moment. He recalled the same type of look on Heather's face whenever she tried to flirt with him, but now it was Astrid. And the look she was giving him was intoxicating. No! He exclaimed, mostly to himself. He stood up off of the couch and paced around the room, trying to calm his racing heart. Something that Astrid found amusing. Stop laughing, it's not helping. Hiccup scolded her, but this only made Astrid's amusement increase. What? My laughing is making your heart race? She asked jokingly, chuckling after her joke. But the look Hiccup shot her back told her that he was about to answer her seriously. Yes. It's the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Hiccup replied, stopping Astrid's laughter flat. She couldn't respond to such an answer, the compliment catching her off guard. Hiccup smiled at the stunned expression on her face after his unexpected words and knelt in front of her on the floor. Astrid, you know I love you. She nodded hesitantly. So please let me take you out to dinner. He pleaded, a hopeful look on his face. Astrid found her words stuck in her throat and she was unable to respond. But she was able to find her words when Hiccup's surprised chuckling awoke her from her trance. What are you laughing at? She asked accusingly, but Hiccup only waved away her accusing gaze with a chuckle and dazzling smile. It's nothing. It's just. He let out another laugh and shook his head. I never thought I'd ever be begging my wife to go on a date with me. He smiled, unexpectedly causing Astrid to join him. You're right, that is kind of funny. She smiled, shaking her head with him at the absurdity of their situation. So, what'll it be, milady? Hiccup asked after a moment of composure, meeting Astrid's eyes with a curious gaze. She smiled brightly back at him, nodding her head enthusiastically at his words and grabbing his hands into her own. However, before Hiccup could stand up, Astrid dragged him back down to the floor. If you answer me one thing. Astrid requested, to which Hiccup immediately agreed. You said you loved me. Hiccup nodded. How? I mean, we've only known each other since we bumped into each other in the corridor at work over half a year ago. So, how? Astrid looked at him curiously, a desperate look in her eye. Reaching up delicately, Hiccup tucked a stray strand of hair behind Astrid's ear and smiled lovingly up at her with a smile. Astrid, the first time I saw you wasn't in that corridor. She raised an eyebrow. The first time I saw you was when you joined the company as Thorald's secretary. His words confused Astrid, who gave him a look of surprised curiosity. But that was almost 5 years ago. Yeah, and it's because of you that I believe in love at first sight. Hiccup smiled up at Astrid and kissed her lips gently and lovingly. There was nothing more behind it than an act of affection between lovers. I did say I'd let you know. Hiccup. Astrid spoke as the two pulled away from one another, their eyes locked as they gasped for air. Yes, Astrid. Can I have my gift now? Astrid smiled cheekily, letting out a small giggle to herself as she watched Hiccup's eyes roll in disbelief. I tell you, you are one hell of a woman, Astrid Horferson. Hiccup commented before standing up and preparing to leave the living room, but Astrid's voice stopped him at the door. Haddock. Hiccup looked towards Astrid with a raised eyebrow. What? Well, we are married after all. So, it's Astrid Haddock. Astrid shrugged, acting as though what she had just said had no value whatsoever. However, Hiccup swore he just felt his heart do a backflip within his chest at Astrid's words. Placing a hand over his heart, he met Astrid's eyes and smiled warmly. I think I just fell for you again. He smiled before rushing out of the room to retrieve her gift. Astrid was left blushing in the living room, resting her hands against her cheeks to cool down the rising temperature of her face. Her mind continued to replay Hiccup's words back to her in repeat, and each time the words made her blush harder. Hiccup quickly returned to see Astrid still affected by his words. So, he wordlessly approached her and made his way behind her figure. He retrieved the gift and slowly placed it around Astrid's neck, waking her up from her trance. The cold metal of the necklace touched her burning skin and caused Astrid to look down at the accessory that Hiccup was attempting to attach to her person. Looking over her shoulder, she met eyes with Hiccup and smiled, grabbing her hair out of the way so that he could properly attach the necklace around her neck. Done. He announced and signaled to Astrid to drop her hair. Looking down at her neck, she could just about make out the shape of a heart, but it didn't look quite right. Why only half? She asked curiously, looking up from her chest, where the necklace rested, and up to meet Hiccup's eyes. He smiled back at her and reached into his shirt to retrieve a necklace of his own. Leaning forward, he gently grabbed Astrid's necklace and connected the two together, which drew together magnetically as though they were meant to be together. Because the other half is with me. Hiccup smiled and locked his gaze with Astrid, whose blush had deepened after his words. Okay, you're gonna have to stop saying such sweet things, otherwise you're going to give me diabetes. Astrid chuckled before pulling Hiccup into a kiss. I love you, Hiccup. I love you too, milady. Chapter 53, Epilogue. Summary. Warning. This chapter contains scenes that some audiences may find inappropriate and disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This chapter does contain scenes of a mature nature. If this is not for you, then ignore this chapter. Chapter text. It had been a long week for both Hiccup and Astrid, and it didn't seem like things were going to slow down anytime soon. After Thorold was apprehended and later imprisoned for fraud and blackmail, Hiccup was soon promoted to chairman of the board and allowed his father to relax into early retirement. Although Hiccup and Astrid didn't have a child just yet, Stoic was more than confident that there would be an heir to the company soon enough and willingly gave the company over to Hiccup. But now, that meant that Hiccup had a lot of paperwork to catch up on before he was ready to meet with the board members and discuss their first changes to the company that Hiccup wanted. It was hard work, and the unorganized mess of Stoic's office had taken both Hiccup and Astrid days to sort out. Nothing had been going right for them for about a month, and they hadn't even done anything with each other for such a long time that Astrid was beginning to forget what kissing Hiccup even felt like. Astrid finally sent the final email of the day and set down the papers that she had finished onto the pile ready to head into Hiccup's office. She placed the final file onto the pile and let out a heavy sigh, relaxing into her chair with a heavy slump. Her arms hung down over the side of her chair and her eyes rolled into the back of her head as she gazed up at the ceiling. How much longer is this going to take before it's all back to normal? Astrid wondered to herself as she looked up at the plain, white color of the ceiling above her. Personally, she was getting irritated by how little action she and Hiccup had been getting, and she had been growing more and more impatient. Just one night, that's all she was asking for. Sighing again, Astrid stood herself up from her desk chair, straightened her back and collected up the pile of papers and files to head into Hiccup's office. Upon opening the door, she looked upon a slumped figure of Hiccup who had fallen asleep at his desk. His head was laid upon a pile of papers and his hand was rested on his keyboard, presumably in the middle of typing something before he fell asleep. Astrid giggled to herself at the sight of the man at the desk, his chest heaving slowly from each relaxed breath as he slept. Arriving in front of his desk and quietly placing the pile of files upon Hiccup's desk, Astrid made her way around the desk and gently shook her husband awake. Hiccup. Hiccup. She whispered gently, her voice getting louder with each call of his name to rouse him from sleep. After the 10th call of his name, Hiccup's eyes flutter open with a groggy sigh from his mouth. His eyes fell upon Astrid's smiling face and his pupils sparkled in delight at seeing his wife before him. Sitting upright in his chair, Hiccup smiled up at Astrid, who was stood beside him, and he pulled her down onto his lap, her legs off to one side whilst her arms wrapped around his neck. "Well, hello there milady. What are you doing in here?" he asked curiously, his hands gently kneading her waist as though she were a delicious lump of cookie dough. Astrid smiled and played with the small strands of hair at the back of his neck. "I had some more files to give you." She gestured at the growing pile of work sitting upon Hiccup's desk. "It never seems to end, does it?" She chuckled, moving her eyes from the desk and back over to Hiccup. However, as their eyes met, Astrid sensed a different look behind her husband's eyes, and it made her curious. "What? You have no idea what you do to me, do you?" Hiccup muttered to himself as he buried his face into Astrid's neck, his breath tickling the skin there causing Astrid to shudder. Trying to push him away, Astrid moved her position on Hiccup's lap but was pinned to place by his strong grip around her waist. "Hiccup!" She giggled loudly, pushing against his chest to remove his face from her neck as her hips continued to move upon his lap. "Stop it! That tickles," she announced, still struggling to free herself from Hiccup's grip. "You drive me insane." Hiccup growled lowly, his words rumbling through his throat and causing a new sensation to ripple across Astrid's skin as Hiccup placed his lips upon her neck and subtly sucked the skin there. "Hiccup! What are you?" Her breathing became rapid and she could barely speak as Hiccup's mouth floated across her neck, painting a beautiful landscape across her skin with every kiss and love bite. A moan erupted from her mouth unconsciously as Hiccup bit into her neck once more and the sound made Hiccup growl louder. "Oh gods, Astrid!" Hiccup finally pulled himself away from her neck, his own breathing rapid and uneven as he looked upon the artwork he had just created. "I'm sorry. I just couldn't help myself." Hiccup admitted guiltily, shaking his head sadly as he wondered what Astrid must think of him. He was so caught up in his own desires he didn't even stop to check whether it was okay. "It's okay," Hiccup. Astrid reassured him, gently cupping his cheek with one hand as Astrid forced Hiccup's gaze upon her. "If it hadn't been okay, you would know. It's just, with all this work piling up and you wandering in here in this skirt." "Ah!" Hiccup groaned, collapsing his head away from her and into his hand. "You must think I'm some animalistic pervert who can't even control himself in a work environment." Hiccup insulted himself, shaking his head in his hand as he scolded himself for being so reckless. "Well," Astrid started, looking around the office and the outside corridors for any remaining employees. "We are the only ones here, right?" Astrid asked, causing Hiccups to lift his head up from his hand. "Yes," he answered, unsure where Astrid was going with her questions. "And I have always wanted to do it in your office," Astrid mentioned, subtly loosening the tie around Hiccup's neck as she spoke. Her actions excited Hiccup, but he restrained himself and tightened his grip around her waist. "Here? Yeah, here," she whispered erotically, her face dipping close to his ear so that her voice was practically oozing into his ear. "Don't you want to do it here too? Seeing me riding on your lap in this chair, or perhaps spread out on your desk waiting for you? I know I've dreamt about it, what about you?" Astrid's words were enough to drive Hiccup's insane and the remaining thread of reason in his brain snapped. Before Astrid could react, Hiccup jumped up off of his office chair with Astrid still in his arms and planted her on top of his desk. Hiccup stood in front of her in between her legs with an arm on either side of her waist, his body leaned towards her as his face inched closer to her own. Astrid wrapped her arms around Hiccup's neck and smiled at her husband's actions, glad he finally got the hint and took the initiative. "Come on then, show me what you got," Astrid challenged as Hiccup stood hovering in front of her face, waiting for the signal to proceed. When the words fell from Astrid's mouth, Hiccup quickly pulled Astrid further towards him on the desk and thrust his hips towards her, leaving no gap between their hips. Hiccup dove down to Astrid's lips and kissed her passionately, no gentleness or love behind it, just pure lust and desire. The kiss was feverish and desperate, both of them begging for more from the other whilst also trying to give what the other was asking for. It was a battle, a push and pull from both sides, and neither one of them was winning. Soon, the clothes were discarded and flung to various places around the room, a bra on the filing cabinet, a shirt on the floor, a jacket on the desk, a shoe near the door. Garments were carelessly tossed in the heat of the moment, flung to the far reaches of the office as Hiccup and Astrid lost themselves in the lust of their own actions. Gods, you're beautiful. Hiccup complimented as he took a look at Astrid's naked torso, her chest on full display for him. His gaze caused a small blush to dust over Astrid's cheeks as she felt awkward under his gaze, however, his words told her everything she needed to hear. You're not so bad yourself. Astrid complimented back, caressing her fingers over Hiccup's skin and over the vagabs he hid beneath his shirts. Oh my! Astrid muttered to herself as she felt the muscles beneath her fingers move slightly, the motion arousing her further. Hiccup smirked at Astrid's words and pushed her back onto the desk so that she lay upon it with her whole body on display for him. Hiccup pushed up the skirt on Astrid's waist and ripped away the undergarments underneath, leaving her completely exposed to him. As he looked over her body, taking in the divine beauty that lay before him, Hiccup hesitated. His hesitation piqued Astrid's attention as she laid stretched out on the desk before her husband, and she rose her head up from the desk looking at him curiously as he looked between himself and her. What is it? Astrid asked, her breath slightly ragged from the hormones rushing through her body. Hiccup smiled and shook his head, returning his tight grip around her waist as he gave her a reassuring look. She looked more than ready for him, but some small voice inside him was still holding him back from loving her like the countless times they had before. He still didn't truly believe he deserved her. That he was everything that Astrid wanted. Whether she wanted more. It's nothing, it's just. What? Astrid asked, growing slightly impatient. I don't want to disappoint your fantasies. Hiccup admitted, slowly caressing her area with his hips, not quite entering but not quite hovering there. Astrid rolled her eyes and hauled her body up off the desk so that her hips didn't move but her arms were holding up her body as they stretched out behind her on the desk. Hiccup. She reached up a hand and caressed his cheek. You are all I could ever want and all I will ever need. Trust me when I say this, you always, always exceed my expectations. Smiling brightly with a blushing face, Astrid met Hiccup's eyes with a confident nod. Really? Yes, I mean. When we first had sex, I would never have believed I was sleeping with a virgin. Astrid chuckled, smiling fondly at the memory. You don't mean that, do you? Hiccup asked, gaining confidence with each of Astrid's words. Of course I do. No woman, who has slept with a virgin, ever thought, wow. Astrid chuckled, leaning in close to Hiccup's ear to whisper her next words. Because you are a devil in disguise when it comes to pleasure, and I sure as hell don't regret the man who gave me the best sex of my life. Astrid complimented. As she was about to speak again, her words were cut off as Hiccup thrust his hips forwards, causing the words to stop in Astrid's throat and turn into an erotic set of moans. He entered into her so suddenly that her body erased all memory of language from Astrid's mind as deep, intense pleasure overtook her body. Every time they did this, Astrid never got used to Hiccup's size and the feel of him inside her, the stretch as he entered her always giving her that burst of emotions that she always craved whenever she had sex. Her gasps and moans, each begging for more than the last, fueled Hiccup's desire and pent up his stamina as he felt his speed increase with every thrust. Each thrust was more vigorous and rough than the last as Hiccup chased his high, gripping Astrid's hips tighter as he moved. Astrid could no longer sustain her upright position on the desk and felt her arms give way behind her, her whole body becoming numb from the pleasure Hiccup was giving her as she laid upon the desk, her back rubbing into the wooden structure holding her up. With each thrust, Astrid could feel the desk moving beneath her back, screeching slightly against the floorboard beneath as Hiccup rutted into her faster and faster. Both of them were drawing closer to their highs, the explosion of ecstasy and desire about to burst forth formed their bodies in a fiery blast. Hiccup's speed increased, rubbing Astrid raw inside as she could barely keep up with the pace, her mouth dry from her ragged breaths and her back becoming bruised from rubbing against the desk so rapidly. I'm close. Hiccup cried, bending down close to Astrid's body, cupping her chest in his hands as he reached for that high, Astrid following close behind as her moans grew in volume. Me too. She screamed as her high suddenly washed over her in an unexpected explosion. As the wave hit her like a freight train, Hiccup dove down and connected his lips with hers, also reaching his high in time with hers. Their bodies shivered and jerked along with each other as they rode out the ecstasy and pleasure that was coursing through their bodies blissfully and gently, no in any rush to vacate. Hiccup rested in his position for a few moments before deciding to withdraw and step away from Astrid, leaving her blissed out and completely fulfilled. Her breathing was erratic and her body was on fire as she could feel every emotion and every nerve in her body reacting to the feeling that Hiccup had just given to her. Now how could I ever be disappointed with that performance? Astrid announced, chuckling to herself as she attempted to get her breath back, Hiccup smiling to himself as he delicately collected his trousers from the floor around him. Was that everything you fantasized about? Hiccup asked curiously, appearing in Astrid's vision as he hovered his face above hers, their lips inches apart as Astrid's breath tickled his skin. Smiling brightly, Astrid pulled him down to her level and kissed him aggressively on the lips, almost stimulating him for another round but pulling away before he could get the idea. It was so much more. The end.